Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from. Also, give a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. We found an underground ocean on Mars. Problem is, it's not made of water. Oceans have always terrified me. Just the feeling of open water, not knowing how far below you something could be lurking in the depths, waiting to devour me with no rhyme or reason as to why, just the primal urge to feed. Figured getting away from Earth would solve that fear, especially considering Mars was mostly desert as far as the eyes could see. Bet you didn't know there's a whole terraforming colony up there already, did you? Yup, ever since the 90s when we sent the first small crew up, the world's governments have been steadily supplying scientists, builders, and equipment to Outpost Genesis. Work has been slow going, but we've seen a hell of a lot of progress over the couple of decades we've been up there. Hell, I've been doing 3-year-on, 2-month-off stints for the past 20 years, slowly helping to build up a survivable planet for my fellow humans. Honestly though, I love it here. Things are different, sure, and I'm not entirely used to missing some Earth commodities after all these years, but knowing we're up here for a real good reason is enough for me to look past all that. We've known for years now that the Earth wasn't going to be sustainable for life as we know it now, either due to climate issues or overpopulation, eventually making things go batshit insane. Hell, up here we even have a running bet on exactly what's going to cause Earth to blink out of existence first, and most of us are pretty sure it's going to be human hubris and violence. As cruel as the Earth could be to us, humanity was always finding ways to be even more cruel to each other. Up here, though, I didn't have to worry about that. Meals were taken care of, I had friends to go out drinking with after we got done with the tasks of the day, and things were honestly pretty comfortable. Maybe 400 of us lived up here in total, everyone with their own job and duty to the outpost. I do geographic surveys, picking out the best spots on the planet for new outposts, resource stations, things like that. The best part is, it pays well, and I haven't had to spend a damn cent while I'm up here. So the account back home is bursting whenever I decide to retire. The sun came up and signaled a start to the day, waking me from a delightful dream to an awful, awful hangover. My head was pounding like someone was taking a jackhammer to the base of my skull. And the last thing I want to do is take a research buggy out with 2 other surveyors. Work is work, though, and there's no calling out for hangovers up here unless you really, really want to get in trouble. So, against my will, for the most part, I met up with Sandra and Sho in the transport bay to get on the metaphorical road. "You look like shit," Sho said, laughing at me as I walked into the locker room. He was already halfway into his pressure suit, making sure everything was locked in and secure before we entered the atmosphere of Mars. "What time did you end up tapping out?" "Probably around 1. You?" I asked, finding my way to the nearby sink so I could cold water on my face. It hit like a brick wall, waking me up much more. I was out of there by 11, had my drinks, did my rounds, and my ass was in bed before midnight. He retorted, "Is Teller here yet?" Sandra said, busting into the locker room, already suited up, a huge pack of supplies in her arms. Through the door into the transport garage, I could see our home for the day. One of the mobile survey labs that were scattered throughout the outpost. It was like a small RV, set up with seals, ventilation, and everything needed to do our jobs out in the harsh desert of the Red Planet. "Mornin'," was about all I could mumble back to her, dragging myself over to the locker containing my Atmos suit. I hated these things, even after all the years I've been using them, and it was like being put into a little cage. I went diving once in my life, and it felt like the same thing, knowing that only the helmet you're wearing is keeping you from a terrible fate of suffocation, whether it be under the seas or in the hot sands right outside. Told you. Should have gone to bed earlier last night instead of hitting that last Jack and Coke. Sandra was laughing now as well, turning back with her bag of supplies to load up the research vehicle. All I could do was grumble my discontent as I crawled into the Atmos suit, hearing the pressurized hiss as the last seal snapped into place. Sho walked out to the vehicle before I could leave the room, telling me I had 5 minutes to finish sobering up. What? They gonna give me a Martian DUI? I shot back, grumpier now. Not sure why I was so irritable today, but something just felt more off than usual. It took a few minutes, but we all finally loaded into the survey RV, making our way west toward the newest survey site. We had a lot of luck in the past few weeks discovering areas that could possibly support life, with the right push, of course, and things were looking pretty bright for the first time in years up here. Maybe that's why I felt so off, the feeling that something could go wrong when everything was going so inexplicably right lately. The drive was a nightmare, though. Know how the infrastructure on Mars is set up? It's not. Any expedition we took was traversing rough, red sand and rocky terrain, with the huge wheels on the RV barely able to handle some of the more jagged chunks of rock that would spike up from nowhere under the sands. I swear the wheels on this thing would tear up a whole mountain back home. But here, every little rock they ran over felt like someone stabbing a dagger into the back of my head. Maybe 3 hours later, we finally reached our destination. I might have ended up asleep if I wasn't the one driving, but Sho and Sandra decided to do their pre-survey checks on our way there, so I was left with a short stick. When we arrived, I could see why we were being sent to study this place. In the midst of the red sands that were stretching around for miles, this single formation of rock stood waiting. It wasn't quite big enough to be a mountain, but as tall as a 5-story building, maybe. It went up high enough that we would probably need the entire day just to climb up. Seriously? We have to get up there? I said, letting out an even bigger groan than when we took off. Nope. Under it. Sho answered, heading past me out of the doors. I could see on closer inspection that there was a small opening at the base of the structure. A cave, entrance 4 wide enough for a small truck to pass through, was there, gaping open as if inviting us into the darkness beyond. Grab some flares and floodlights. We're going to take the buggy as far as we can. I pressed a button, loosing the small transport buggy we held in a small bay at the back of the survey RV. It rumbled out with a small hiss, the open cabin and bed in the back already piled with what we would need. Just in case, though, we grabbed a few more of the flares and high-powered lamps. If it was dark, we were going to at least be prepared. Even with all the light we were holding in reserve, it took a moment to gather courage once we reached the cave mouth. Everything beyond was pitch black, a complete absence of any kind of light source. We turned on the brights on the buggy, and those were barely able to penetrate past the first few meters. All we could tell was that the ground sloped downward hard almost immediately, meaning we had a descent in store. Ready, boys? Sandra asked, looking to Sho and I both before pulling one of the flares from a bag. Might be making a discovery that will change humanity's future, after all. Been hearing that for years, Sho mentioned. Sandra chuckled, handing each of us flares to keep in our belt. We set off, brights cutting through the darkness maybe 20 meters ahead, with the abyss running endlessly ahead of us. The rumbling of our wheels echoed off high walls, crunching over hard rock beneath us. As we got further in, the rocky sand of Mars' surface gave way to solid red stone. I found myself tapping the brakes more frequently as we went further down, the descent becoming steeper exponentially. Hey, think we're going to have to go on foot from here. Drop-off is getting too dangerous for the buggy, I said, slowing down enough to pull the emergency and set it in park. Never thought I would need a parking brake on Mars. We set off on foot, loading up flashlights and flares, along with a few small light markers to find our way back more easily. Not like the path was very non-linear, but when you're underground, it's easy to get disoriented. Our boots echoed loudly as we walked across the smooth red rock, shining like a beautiful granite below us. It was so much more brilliant than the dull rock on the surface, almost mesmerizing in the swirling patterns set deep into the stone. Drip, drip, drip. All three of us stopped at the same time, the sounds setting off billions of alarms in our minds that all pointed to that life-changing discovery, water on fucking Mars. We all looked at each other, not even daring to believe we were the ones to find something like this. We've been theorizing about this for decades, maybe centuries, but to be the ones that actually find it, we would be fucking gods back on Earth. No way, Sandra whispered. We're gonna be loaded. Sho was giggling already. Don't get your hopes up just yet. Our luck it's fucking oil or something, I mentioned. Oh, so you Americans will be up here in no time. Sho laughed louder. We all kept moving forward, scanning the walls with bright flashlights, hoping to find the source of the drip. It took minutes of walking, the drip echoing louder through every step we took. Hey, it's in our Constitution. We're allowed, I retorted. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of that sweet, sweet oil money. Sandra chuckled as we walked on, still scanning when we noticed a faint glow coming from further down, bright blue tinted red against the stone encasing us. We didn't stop, but I know I held my breath for the next few meters before we entered the huge open cavern. Above us, a cavern of stars was spread out for miles, phosphorescent blue, shining down from something on the stone roof. As we watched, the occasional drop would fall from them, landing atop the sprawling ocean split in front of us. The light reflected a deep red on the liquid surface below. A solid, shining pathway of rock divided the sea in front of us, glowing bright with the same bioluminescence. I pulled out a test tube from one of my belt compartments, moving to the edge of the liquid substance to take a sample. Don't just stick your hand in, Sandra shouted. I'm not an idiot, I mentioned, removing a small pair of tongs from another pocket, gripping the tube tight enough to keep hold but loose enough not to shatter it. I made sure to go slow, dipping it down into the strange subterranean ocean. It took more force than I expected, the substance being much more viscous than expected. When I pulled the tube back up, it was dripping from the outside, slowly joining the echo of whatever was falling from the ceiling. I capped it, shaking it off before bagging and wrapping it to protect the sample. After it was safely sealed up, I shined my flashlight on it to get a clearer look. It was a deep crimson, thick, and it looked like something was swirling around in it. Possible organisms in it? God, getting this under a microscope? We found something big, y'all. Should we go ahead further? Sho asked, walking to where the small pathway narrowed in, leading deep through the ocean cavern, a split in the Red Sea. He was shining his flashlight down the way, trying to see into the deep black punctuated by blue, glowing stars. There was no end in sight to the cavern, and the ceiling was so high the light's beam wouldn't even reach it, leaving the glowing stars above to their own devices. Not yet. I want to come down here more prepared first, Sandra said, standing to put away a sample of the phosphorescent material. Looks like a type of spore, but we need to have more light, some flotation devices for safety. Getting this back to the folks at base is going to be huge. All right, so what? Mark it and head back to the rig? Or should we hit the gas back to base ASAP? I asked, stepping away from the edge. There was something about it that was making me feel odd. The discovery was something to be proud of, and I was happy about it. But there was this nagging sense, that feeling that I shouldn't be here, that nobody should be here, ever. Actually, I vote for hitting the base as fast as we can. I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting the creeps. Same here, Sho replied. We packed it in, turning to leave. We were so focused on the sea in front of us that we didn't even think to look back at where the entrance. Now noticing the walls around the small cavern opening, dozens of etchings were in the cavern wall, stitched together in a bizarre series of shapes and drawings, making no comprehensible pattern from our perspective. Sho walked over, putting a hand up to one of the deeply carved lines in front of him. The smooth bores in the wall were finely crafted, put in with utmost care, so that doesn't happen naturally. I stammered out, approaching another section of the wall. Everything was immaculate. Compared to the rough, rocky surface above us, this was smooth, carved with passion by hands in reverence, or perhaps fear. That chill ran up my spine again as I stepped back, looking up to where the bizarre glyphs extended high to the cavern ceiling. There was no visible end. Even with our high-powered lights, no telling what they became further up. All right, that's enough for today. Let's head back. The ascent back up was taxing. The incline much more steep than it seemed on the way down. The thought kept coming into my head that there was something back there, waiting for us to turn our backs on it so it could sneak closer, getting the jump on us. Every time I looked back, though, the empty cave greeted my eyes, with nothing to show beyond a blanket of darkness. By the time we made it back to the buggy, we were all completely exhausted, panting hard in the stale air of our suits. We loaded in, hitting the reverse and relying on autopilot to get us out of there and back to the surface in about 30 minutes, with only minor bumps and scrapes from the narrow sections of the tunnel. The glaring light of the surface was intense, sun baking down to give us a reminder of how hot the surface was then down below. The RV was there, covered in red dust as if it had been through a sandstorm. It took us a moment, but once everything was loaded in, we set off back to the base, samples in hand and eager to look closer once we returned. "Garage, we're coming in," I radioed once we began to get close. "Research vehicle returning, we've got some big news." "Teller, that you? Are Sho and Sandra there too? Where the fuck have you been?" Comms responded, almost screaming into the mic. "We've been out at that research spot. You literally let us out this morning." I replied, confused. "You've been gone for 2 days? The hell did you do out there?" Comms asked back, confusion taking over the anger and fear in their voice. "Did something happen? Did you break down?" We got back into the garage within minutes, deciding to check in and debrief there, rather than explain over comm systems. 2 higher-ups came in to meet with us, shuffling us into a small lab nearby. They didn't enter, though, instead standing at the small observation window and speaking in through the comm system. "Do you have any explanation for being out for 2 days? You were supposed to be back within 12 hours of departure." One of the men said, "General Pratt, an older man in charge of the U.S. interests up here on base. We've been very concerned. A rescue mission was being organized when you 3 drove back up." Hao, leader of the Chinese delegation on the base, was looking at us with much less rage than Pratt was. "Look, we were gone for maybe 4 or 5 hours. We got to the designated point, found a cave, went down, stayed for a minute, came back up, now we're here. It's only been a short few hours." Sandra was trying to explain, but none of us were seeing eye to eye. Everything was off, and the concerned expressions on these 2 men's faces were making us all uncomfortable. "What about the suit footage? We have GoPros set up in those things, so just check them, you'll see." Sho was almost frantic, the prospect of that missing time almost breaking his brain. We had discussed it on the way in, with none of us able to account for it, all agreeing we were only gone for a few hours. The more we thought about it, the more it made sense, though. The dust on the RV couldn't have gotten there in just those few hours, and there weren't any storms recorded in the area at the time we were gone. So, where the hell did the time go? We're actually checking suit cameras right now. We don't know what in the world you found down there, but right now we're 7 hours in, and the footage, as soon as you get ready to leave down there, just becomes still. You have your samples, you're packed up, talking about your discovery, then before you can turn around to leave, everything gets weird. All 3 of you stop, standing like statues the entire time. We've got a couple of guys skimming the footage, but so far there's no change. The batteries on the cameras likely died during the time you were out, but that's not the biggest problem here," Pratt explained. "That makes no damn sense. We would have run out of our air reserves," I mentioned. "We only have 24 hours in those things, but there was enough for us to make it back." "You took your damned helmets off. You didn't use any of your air reserves," Hal leveled, looking each of us in the eyes in turn. "So how the hell are you here right now?" We what?" I stammered out. "No, that makes no sense. We had our helmets on the entire time. None of us were stupid enough to take them off up here. That would be instant death. So what the hell? Look, there's no way any of us would have done that. We're not stupid." "Wouldn't be up here if you were," Pratt said, looking into my eyes now, seriousness in his furrowed brow. "But I need to know what the hell would make y'all do that." "We don't know, sir," Sho whispered. Sandra was staring blankly in front of her, and he had his hands crossed in front of him in prayer. There was no telling what was going through their minds, but I know mine was racing with thoughts of the past few hours. I didn't feel any different. There was nothing off about my body. Once we got out of the Atmos suits when we entered, it was refreshing to breathe clean air again, but nothing indicated they were off before then. Look, we're going to keep you three in observation for a bit, just to make sure everything is baseline, Hao said, putting his hands up to calm us, despite everyone's dumbfounded, quiet state. We'll let you have lab 2, though. That way you can study your findings in the meantime. Sir, are we going to go back to Earth again? Shou asked, fear in his eyes now. He was thinking the same thing we were, having no helmets on, especially down there. All kinds of possible pathogens or biological hazards could have gotten to us. There was no telling what we may have brought back to the base. God, what have we done? I don't know, Hao said, a heavyweight in his voice. I do know that your discovery will lead to immense advancements for humanity, though, and you will be a part of history, no matter what. That's not promising, I muttered, looking at the lab around me. Where are my samples? They'll be brought in momentarily. We're cataloging items right now to be sure. Pratt said, nodding over to a small exchange door on the lab wall. Once it's ready, they'll put it through there. Throw some whiskey in there too if you can. If I'm trapped here, at least let me drink, I mentioned, hoping for the best. Pratt just nodded, so I'm taking it as a good sign. The two officers walked away then, leaving us to ponder our own mortality for the foreseeable future. I tried to sit in one of the chairs in the corner, but something was making me stay up, only letting me pace nervously as we awaited the samples for study. Sandra was only staring ahead at the wall, while Shou was muttering to himself constantly, going over ways in his head to find out what may be wrong with us or if there was some way to test. We were in a lab, so not like there weren't resources around, but with the addled state our brains are in, there's no thinking straight like that. Maybe an hour, maybe 2. Finally, a bin was pushed through the exchange drawer. Our sample vials inside, along with a few other items from the RV. Underneath, a bottle of Jack nestled in for all of us to split. I practically dove for it, desperate to see what we had found, what was keeping us in here, and for a drink. Look, I'm well aware at this point I probably have a problem. Least of my worries now, though. Taking a swig straight from the bottle, then offering it to the others who both shook their heads, I was ready to face whatever we were up against. One of the samples went into a test to see exactly what the hell it was, and I took a small drop, putting it right on a slide and barely getting it in place before pressing my eye to the scope. No fucking way, I said, focusing in on the scope dials to get a more clear look at what was below. Small, red cells formed and slipped around each other in the fluid. Sandra, Shou, I need you to look at this. What is it? Shou asked, coming forward. Sandra didn't respond for a moment, having to shake herself out of a stupor as I tapped her on the shoulder. Look and tell me what you think, I said, making room in front of the microscope for him. He put his eyes to the viewer, adjusting for a moment before gasping, stepping back and almost stumbling into one of the counters. Sandra stepped up to look and had the same response, falling to the ground and scrambling backward. Is that blood? Shou was holding his stomach, a dry heaving starting to work its way up to escape his mouth. Can't blame him, considering that was my first thought as well when seeing the red cells pulsating and moving past each other. Why is it moving? I don't know. I really don't know. I have some testing to see if it really is blood. There's something else in there too, though. Did you see it? I asked, adjusting the slide toward another direction. Look again. Shou peered back into the scope, gasping as he saw the same thing I did only moments ago. A small, dark organism, moving its way through the red cells and eating them. I don't know if that's what it was actually doing, but just it touching the red cells made it begin to shrink, decaying to nothing before it moved on to another. Could that be in us? He asked, looking from me to Sandra. I noticed now his eyes were bloodshot, a dark red against pale skin. It creeps me out, but I'm chalking it up to lack of sleep. Hell, I probably look no better. The machine nearby dinged, telling me the first vial's component testing was done. Paper began feeding from the computer nearby, the results of the machine's work. I hesitated, swallowing the lump in my throat before grabbing the paper, ripping it off and closing my eyes as I brought it to my face. You have to look. Have to. If you thought that was chilling. The next story will leave you frozen in fear. My mother hasn't been the same since I found an old recipe book. When I got the call that my uncle had been arrested again, I wasn't surprised. He was charming, reckless, and unpredictable, the kind of guy who knew his way around trouble and didn't seem to mind it. But this time felt different. It wasn't just a few months, he was facing 10 years, a decade behind bars for possession of over a pound of cocaine. They said it was hidden in the trunk of his car, packed away as casually as groceries. It stung. He'd promised us he was clean, that his wild years were behind him. Even at Thanksgiving, he'd go out of his way to remind us all that he was on the straight and narrow. We'd had our doubts. Old habits don't vanish overnight, after all. But a pound? None of us had seen that coming. My uncle swore up and down the drugs weren't his, said he was framed, that someone wanted to see him gone for good. But when we pressed him on it, he'd just clam up, muttering that spending a decade locked away was better than what they would do to him. After he was sentenced, my mom called, her voice tight, asking if I could go to his place and sort through his things. It was typical family duty, the kind of thing I couldn't turn down. I wasn't close with him, but family ties run deep enough to leave you feeling responsible, even when you know you shouldn't. So, with him locked away for the next 10 years, I volunteered to clear out his apartment, move his things to storage. I didn't know why I was so eager, but maybe I felt like it was the least I could do. The place was a disaster, exactly as I expected. His kitchen cupboards were filled with thrift store pots and pans, each one more scratched and mismatched than the last. I could see him at the stove, cigarette dangling from his lips, stirring whatever random meal he'd thrown together in those beat-up pans. The living room was its own kind of graveyard. Ashtrays covered nearly every surface, filled with weeks' worth of cigarette butts, and the walls were a deep, sickly yellow from years of constant smoke. Even the light switches had turned the same shade, crusted over from the nasty habit that had stained every inch of the place. It was clear he hadn't cracked a window in years. I found myself running my fingers along the walls, almost wondering if the yellow residue would come off. It didn't. In one corner of the room was his pride and joy. A collection of Star Trek figurines and posters, lined up on a crooked shelf he'd likely hammered up himself. He'd been a fan for as long as I could remember, always rambling about episodes I'd never seen and characters I couldn't name. Dozens of plastic figures with blank, determined stares watched me pack up their home, my uncle's treasures boxed up and ready to be hidden away for who knew how long. It took a few days, but I finally got the majority of the place packed. 3 trips in my truck, hauling boxes and crates to the storage facility across town, until the apartment was stripped bare. The only things left were the stained carpet, the nicotine-coated walls, and the broken blinds barely hanging in the windows. There was no way he was getting his security deposit back. The damage was practically baked into the place. But it didn't matter anymore. As I sorted through the last of the kitchen, my hand brushed against something tucked away in the shadows of the cabinet. I pulled it out and found myself holding a small, leather-bound book. The cover was cracked and worn, the leather soft from age, with a faint smell of cigarette smoke clinging to it. The pages inside were yellowed, brittle, and marked with years of kitchen chaos, stains, smudges, and scribbled notes everywhere. The entries were scattered, written down in no particular order, almost as if whoever kept this book had jotted recipes down the moment they'd been created, without thought of organization. As I skimmed the pages, a feeling crept over me that this book might have belonged to my grandfather. He was the one who'd brought the family together, year after year, with his homemade dishes. Every holiday felt anchored by the meals he'd cooked, recipes no one had ever been able to quite replicate. This book could very well hold the secrets to those meals, a piece of him that had somehow made its way into my uncle's hands after my grandfather passed. And yet, I couldn't shake a strange sense of dread as I held it. The leather was cold against my hands, almost damp, and a chill worked its way through me as I turned the pages. It felt wrong, somehow, as if there was more in this book than family recipes. Curious about the book's origins, I brought it to my mom. She took one look at the looping handwriting on the yellowed pages and nodded, her face softening with recognition. "This was your grandfather's," she said, almost reverently, tracing her fingers along the ink. She hadn't seen it in years, and when I told her where I'd found it, a look of surprise flickered across her face. She had been searching for the book for ages and had never realized her brother had kept it all this time. As she flipped through the pages, nostalgia mingled with something else, maybe a touch of sadness or reverence. I could tell this book meant a lot to her, which only strengthened my resolve to preserve it. "Could I hang on to it a little longer?" I asked. "I want to scan it, make a digital copy for myself so we don't lose any of his recipes." My mom agreed without hesitation, grateful that I was taking the time to safeguard something she hadn't known was still around. So I got to work. Over the next few weeks, in the gaps of my day-to-day life, I carefully scanned each page. I wasn't too focused on the content itself, more concerned with making sure each recipe was clear and legible, and didn't pay close attention to the strange ingredients and odd notes scattered throughout. My only goal was to make the text accessible, giving life to a digital copy that would be preserved indefinitely. Once I finished, I spent a few hours merging the scanned images, piecing them together to create a seamless digital version. When it was finally done, I returned the original to my mom, feeling a strange mix of relief and satisfaction. The family recipes were now safe, and I thought that was the end of it. But that sense of unease I'd felt in the kitchen, holding that worn leather cover, lingered longer than I expected. In the months that followed, I didn't think much about the recipe book. Scanning it had been a small side project, the kind I'd meant to follow up on by actually cooking a few of my grandfather's old dishes. But, like so many side projects, I got wrapped up in other things, and the book's contents drifted to the back of my mind, filed away and forgotten. Then Thanksgiving rolled around. I made my way to my parents' place, expecting the usual: turkey, stuffing, and the familiar spread that had become tradition. When I got there, though, I noticed something different right away. A large bird sat in the middle of the table, roasted to perfection, but something about it didn't look right. It was too small for a turkey, and its skin looked darker, almost rougher than the golden brown I was used to. "Nice chicken," I said, figuring they'd switch things up for a change. My mom just shook her head. "It's not a chicken," she said quietly. "It's a hen." I gave her a confused look. "What's the difference?" I asked, half laughing, expecting her to shrug it off with a quick explanation. Instead, she just stared at me, her eyes unfocused as if she were lost in thought. For a moment, her face seemed distant, almost blank, as though I'd asked a question she couldn't quite place. Then suddenly she blinked, her gaze snapping back to me. "It's just what the recipe called for," she said, a strange edge to her voice. Something about it made the hair on my arms prickle, but I pushed the feeling aside, figuring she'd just been caught up in the cooking chaos. Yet, as I looked at the bird again, a small flicker of unease crept in, settling in the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. After dinner, I pulled my dad aside in the kitchen while my mom finished clearing the table. "What's the deal with Mom tonight?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He just shrugged, brushing it off with a wave of his hand. "You know how your mother is," he said with a small smile, as though her strange excitement was just one of those quirks. He didn't give it a second thought, already moving on. But I couldn't shake the weirdness. The whole meal had been off. The hen, unlike anything we'd had before, was coated in a sweet-smelling sauce that seemed to have a faint hint of walnut to it, almost masking its pale ashen hue. The bird lay on a bed of unfamiliar greens, probably some sort of garnish, alongside perfectly sliced parsnips and radishes that seemed too neatly arranged, like it was all meant to look a certain way. The whole thing was far too elaborate for my mom's usual Thanksgiving style. When she finally sat, she led us in saying grace, her voice soft and reverent. As she began cutting into the hen, a strange glint of excitement lit up her face, one I wasn't used to seeing. She served it up, watching each of us intently as we took our first bites. I wasn't sure what I expected, but as I brought a piece to my mouth, I could tell right away this wasn't the usual Thanksgiving fare. The meat was tough, almost stringy, and didn't pull apart easily, a far cry from the tender turkey or even chicken I was used to. Mom kept glancing between my dad and me with a kind of eager glee, as though she were waiting for us to say something. It was unsettling, her eyes wide, as if she were waiting for us to uncover some hidden secret. When I finally asked, "What's got you so excited, Mom?" she just smiled, her expression softening. "Oh, it's just this cookbook you found from Grandpa's things. It's like having a part of him here with every meal I make." She spoke with a reverence I hadn't heard in her voice for a long time, as though she were talking about more than just food. I gave her a nod, trying to humor her. "Tastes good," I said, hoping she'd ease up. I enjoyed it. But in truth, I wished we had a more familiar Thanksgiving dinner. The meal wasn't exactly bad, but something tasted a little off. I couldn't put my finger on it, and maybe I didn't want to. After we finished, I said my goodbyes and headed home, trying to shake the lingering sense of unease. My mom's face, her excitement, kept replaying in my mind. And then there was the hen itself. Why a hen? Why the pale, ashen sauce? There was something almost ritualistic in the way she'd prepared it, a strange precision I'd never seen from her before. The night stretched on, the questions gnawing at me, taking root in a way that wouldn't let me rest. When I got home, I couldn't shake the weird feeling from dinner. I sat down at my desk, opening the scanned file I'd saved to my desktop months ago. The folder had been sitting there, untouched, and now that I finally had it open, I could see why I'd put it off. The handwriting was dense and intricate, almost a kind of calligraphy, each letter curling into the next. The words seemed to dance across the pages in a strange, whimsical flow. I had to squint, leaning closer to make sense of each line. As I scrolled through the recipes, a chill ran down my spine. They had unsettling names, the kind that felt more like old spells than recipes. Mother's Last Supper porridge, binding broth of bone and leaf, Elder's ember bread, hollow heart soup with morning onion. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but I could almost feel a heaviness creeping into the room, the words themselves holding an eerie energy. Then I found it, the recipe for the dish my mother had made tonight. Ancestors' Offering. The recipe was titled in that same swirling calligraphy, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I read the description. It was for a maple braised hen with black walnut and root puree, though it didn't sound like any recipe I'd ever seen. The instructions were worded strangely, written in a style that made it feel centuries old. Each ingredient was listed with specific purpose and detail, as though it held some secret power. My eyes skimmed down to the meat. It specified a hen, not just any chicken. The body must be that of a mother, it read. I felt a shiver go through me, remembering the strange way my mom had insisted on using a hen, correcting me when I'd casually referred to it as chicken. The instructions continued, noting that the hen had to be served on a bed of lamb's lettuce, a type of honeysuckle, according to a quick Google search. And then, as I read further, a chill seeped into my bones. The recipe stated it must be served just before the end of twilight, as dusk yields to night. I thought back to dinner, and the way we'd all sat down, just as the last of the sun's light faded beyond the horizon. But the final instruction was the worst part, and as I read it, my stomach twisted in revulsion. The recipe called for something it referred to as ancestors' salt. The note at the bottom explained that this salt was a sprinkle of the ashes of those who have returned to the earth, with a warning to use it sparingly, as each grain remembers the one who offered it. I sat back, cold sweat breaking out across my skin as I recalled the pale, ashen sauce coating the hen, the faint, sweet scent it gave off. My mind raced, piecing together what it implied. Had my mom actually used ashes in the meal? Had she used my grandfather's ashes? I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just some old folklore nonsense. But the image of her smiling face as she served us that meal, the gleam in her eyes, crept back into my mind. I felt my stomach churn, bile rising in my throat as the horrifying thought sank deeper. A few days later, the gnawing unease had become impossible to ignore. I told myself I was probably just overreacting, that the weird details in the recipe were nothing more than some strange family tradition I didn't understand. Still, I couldn't shake the dread that crept up every time I remembered that meal. So, I decided to call my mom. I planned it out, careful to come off as casual. The last thing I wanted was for her to think I was accusing her of something as insane as putting ashes in our food. I asked about my dad, about her gardening, anything to warm her up a bit. Then I thanked her for the Thanksgiving dinner, even going so far as to say it was the best we'd had in years. When I finally brought up the recipe book, her voice brightened instantly. "Oh, thank you again for finding it," she said, sounding genuinely pleased. "I had no idea he'd cataloged so many wonderful recipes. I knew your grandfather's cooking was special, but to have all these dishes recorded, like his own little legacy, it's been such a joy." I chuckled, trying to keep my tone light. "I actually looked up that dish you made us, Ancestors Offering. Thought maybe I'd give it a try myself sometime." "Oh, really?" she replied, sounding intrigued. "Yeah, though I thought it was a little strange the recipe specifically calls for a hen and not just a regular chicken, since they're so much tougher. And the part that says it should be the body of a mother," I let the words hang, hoping she'd jump in with some explanation that would make it all seem less sinister. For a moment there was just silence on her end. Then quietly, she said, "Well, that's just how your grandfather wrote it, I suppose." Her voice is different now, lower, as if she were carefully choosing her words. My heart thumped in my chest, and I decided to press a little further. "I also noticed it calls for something called Ancestors Salt," I said, feigning confusion, pretending I hadn't read the footnote that explicitly described it. "What's that supposed to be?" The silence was even longer this time, stretching out until it became a ringing hum in my ears. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I have to go," she murmured, sounding almost dazed. Before I could respond, the line clicked, leaving me in the heavy, stunned quiet. I tried calling her back immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. Her phone was off. My stomach twisted as I stared at the blank screen. I couldn't tell if I was more scared of what I might find out or of what I might already know. I hesitated, but eventually called my dad's phone, feeling a need to at least check in. When he picked up, I told him about my call with Mom and how strange she'd been acting. "She went into her garden right after you two spoke," he said, sounding unconcerned. "Started tending to her plants, hasn't said a word since." I tried nudging him a bit, asking if he could maybe get her to talk to me, but he just brushed it off. "You're overreacting. You know how your mother is. Gets all sentimental over family things. It'll just upset her if you keep nagging her about it. Give her some space." I nodded, trying to take his advice to heart. "Yeah, all right. You're probably right." After we hung up, I resolved to let it go and went about my day, chalking it up to my mom's usual habit of getting overly attached to anything with sentimental value. She'd always treated family heirlooms like they carried something sacred, almost magical. But this time I couldn't fully shake the nagging feeling in the back of my mind, something that made it impossible to forget about that recipe book. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. Sitting back down at my computer, I opened the digital copy and scrolled aimlessly through the pages. Part of me knew it was a bad idea, but I couldn't resist. I let the file skip down to a random section, thinking I'd try making something small, something harmless. As I scrolled, I found myself staring at the very last page, which held a recipe titled Elder's Ember Bread. The instructions were minimal, yet each word seemed heavy, steeped in purpose. Beneath the title, a note read, "Best served in small portions on cold, dark nights. The taste is best enjoyed alone, lest the voices of the past linger too long." I shook my head, half amused, half unnerved. It was all nonsense, I told myself. Probably just some old superstitions my grandfather had picked up along the way. But something about it had my heart pounding just a bit harder. Ignoring the rising chill, I printed the recipe and took it to the kitchen. I'd play along, I figured. It was just bread, after all. I scanned the list of ingredients for Elder's Ember Bread, feeling time slip away as though I'd been pulled into some strange trance. My mind blurred over, details of the process fading into a fog, yet I couldn't stop moving. I gathered everything without really thinking about it, each step drawing me deeper, as though I were following some ancient, well-worn path. I remembered flashes, the sweet scent of elderberry and honey, the earthy weight of raw rye, the dry, pungent aroma of wood burnt to charcoal. At some point, I murmured something under my breath. words of thanks to my ancestors that I hadn't consciously decided to speak. The smell of warmed goat's milk lingered in the air, blending with a creamy, thick butter that had blackened over low heat. A faint scent of yew ash drifted up as I worked, curling into my nose like smoke from an unseen fire. By the time I came to my senses, night had fallen, the kitchen shadowed and still. And there, sitting on the counter, was the bread, a dark, dense loaf, blackened at the crust but glistening with an almost unnatural sheen. It looked rich and moist, and as I stared at it, a strange sense of pride swelled up within me, unnatural and unsettling, like a voice in the back of my mind was urging me to feel pleased, insisting that I'd done well. Without really thinking, I cut myself a slice and carried it to the living room, feeling compelled to enjoy my creation. I took a bite, and the bread filled my mouth with an earthy, bittersweet taste, smoky yet tinged with a subtle berry sweetness. It was unusual, nothing like I'd ever tasted before, but it was oddly satisfying. As I chewed, a warmth bloomed deep in my chest, spreading through me like the steady heat of a wood stove. It was comforting, almost intimate, as if the bread itself were warming me from the inside out. Before I knew it, I'd finished the entire slice, not because I'd particularly enjoyed it, but because some strange sense of obligation had pushed me to finish every bite. When I set the plate down, the warmth remained. A heavy presence settled deep inside me, and in the silence that followed, I could have sworn I felt a faint rhythmic beat, a heartbeat, steady and ancient, pulsing faintly beneath my skin. Over the next few weeks, I found myself drawn back to the elder's ember bread more often than I intended. I'd notice myself in the kitchen, knife in hand, halfway through slicing a thick piece from the loaf, before even realizing I'd gotten up to do it. It was instinctive, almost as if some quiet impulse guided me back to it on those quiet, late nights. Each time I took a bite, that same deep warmth would swell inside me, radiating outward like embers glowing from a steady fire. But unlike the hen my mother had made, a meal that left me with a lingering sense of discomfort, the ember bread felt different. It was as though each bite carried something I couldn't quite place, something familiar and almost affectionate, like a labor of love embedded into every grain. The days blended together, but the questions didn't go away. I tried to reach out to my mother several times, hoping she might open up about the recipe book, maybe explain why we both seemed so drawn to these strange meals. But each time I brought it up, she'd evade the question, either changing the subject or claiming she was too busy to talk. She hadn't invited me over for dinner since Thanksgiving, and the distance between us felt like a slow, widening gulf. Even my dad, when I'd asked about her, shrugged it off, saying she was just going through a phase. But the coldness in her responses, her repeated avoidance of the book, only made me more certain that there was something she wasn't telling me. Still, I kept returning to the ember bread, feeling its subtle pull each time the sun set, as though I were being guided by something unseen. And each time I took a bite, it felt less like a meal and more like communion, a quiet bond that was growing stronger with every piece I consumed. After weeks of unanswered questions, I decided to reach out to my uncle at the prison. I was allowed to leave a message, so I kept it short. Told him it was his nephew, wished him well, and let him know I'd left him $100 in commissary. The next day, he called me back, his voice scratchy over the line but appreciative. "Hey, thanks for the cash," he said with a short chuckle. "You know how it is in here. Money makes things easier." We chatted for a bit, catching up. He'd been in and out of prison so often that I'd come to see it as his way of life. In his 60s now, he talked about his time behind bars with a kind of acceptance, almost relief. "By the time I'm out again, I'll be an old man," he said, almost amused. "It's not the worst place to grow old." Then I took a breath and brought up the reason I'd called. "I don't know if you remember, but when I was packing up your place, I found this old recipe book." I hesitated, then quickly added, I gave it to Mom. Thought she'd get a kick out of it." His response was immediate. The warm, casual tone in his voice shifted, growing cold and sharp. "Listen to me," he said, each word weighted and deliberate. "If you have that book, you need to throw it into a fire." "What?" I stammered, caught off guard. "It's just a cookbook." "It's not just a cookbook," he replied, his voice low, almost trembling. "That book, it brings out terrible things in people. He paused, as though considering how much to say. My father, your grandfather, he was into some dark stuff you don't just find in the back of an old family recipe. And that book, he took a breath. That book wasn't his. It belonged to his mother, your great-grandmother, passed down to him before he even knew what it was. My mother used to say those recipes were meant for desperate times. The gravity of his words settled into me, and I felt the weight of it all suddenly make sense. They were used to survive hard times, he continued, voice quiet. You've heard about what people did during the Great Depression, how desperate families were? But this, he exhaled sharply. Those recipes are ancient, passed down through whispers and word of mouth long before they were ever written down. But they're not for everyday meals. They're for invoking things, bringing things out. The kind of things that can take hold of you if you're not careful. My hand tightened around the phone as a cold shiver traced down my spine, my mind flashing back to the ember bread, the warmth it had left in my chest, the strange satisfaction that hadn't felt entirely my own. Promise me, he continued, his voice almost pleading. Don't let Mom or anyone else use that book for anything casual. Those recipes can keep a person alive in hard times, sure, but they weren't meant to be used. Not unless you're ready to live with the consequences. A chill settled over me as I realized just how deep this all went. I hesitated, then told my uncle the truth. I'd already made one of the recipes. I described Elder's ember bread to him, the earthy sweetness, the warmth it filled me with, leaving out the part about how I'd almost felt compelled to eat it. He let out a harsh sigh and scolded me, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard. You shouldn't have touched that bread. None of it. Do you understand me? I felt a pang of guilt. I know. I'm sorry. I promise I won't make anything else from the book. Good, he said, his voice calming a little. But that's not enough. You have to get that book away from my sister, your mother, before she does something she can't take back. I tried to assure him I'd do what I could, but he cut me off, his tone deadly serious. You need to do this. Something bad will happen if you don't. Over the next few weeks, as Christmas approached, I stayed in touch with him, paying the collect call fees to keep our conversations going. Every time we talked, the discussion would circle back to the book. I'd tell him about my progress, or lack of it, how I'd tried visiting my mom, only for her to brush me off with excuses, saying she was too busy or that it wasn't a good time. And each time I talked to her, she seemed to grow colder, more distant, as if that recipe book were slowly casting a shadow over her. One day, I decided to drop by without any notice at all. When I showed up on her doorstep, she didn't seem pleased to see me. You should have called first, she said with a forced smile. It's rude, just showing up like this. Her tone was tight, her words clipped. I tried to play it off, shrugging and saying I just missed her and wanted to check in. But as I scanned the house, I felt a creeping sense of unease. I looked for any sign of the book, hoping I could find it and take it with me, but it was nowhere to be seen. Each time, I'd leave empty-handed, feeling like I was being watched from the shadows as I walked out the door. Every call with my uncle became more urgent, his insistence that I retrieve the book growing into a kind of desperation. You have to try harder, he'd say, his voice strained. If you don't get that book away from her, something's going to happen. You have to believe me. And deep down, I did believe him. The memory of the ember bread, the strange warmth, and the subtle pull of that old recipe gnawed at me, as though warning me of something far worse waiting in that book. But it was more than that. Something in my mom's voice, her distant gaze, even her scolding felt off. And every time I left her house, I felt a chill settle over me, like I was getting closer to something I wasn't prepared to see. Christmas Day finally arrived, and despite my mother's recent evasions, there was no avoiding me this time. I gathered up the presents I'd bought for them, packed them into my car, and drove to their house, hoping the tension that had grown between us would somehow ease in the warmth of the holiday. When I knocked, she opened the door and offered a quick, half-hearted hug. The scent of baked ham and sweet glaze wafted out, thick and rich, and for a second, I thought maybe she'd set aside that strange recipe book and return to her usual cooking. I relaxed a little, hoping the day would be less tense than I'd feared. "Where's Dad?" I asked, glancing around for any sign of him. "Oh, he's in the garage," she said, waving it off. "Got a new gadget he's fussing over. You know him." She gestured toward the dining room where plates and holiday decorations were already set up. "Why don't you sit down? Lunch is almost ready." I took off my coat, glancing back at her. She was already turned away, busying herself with the last touches on the table, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical, and I could sense the familiar warmth in her was missing. It was like she was there, but somehow absent. Not wanting to disobey my mother on Christmas, I placed my gifts with the others under the tree and took my seat at the dining table. The plate in front of me was polished and waiting, a silver fork and knife perfectly aligned on either side, but the emptiness of it left an unsettling pit in my stomach. "Should I go get Dad?" I called out, glancing back toward the hallway that led to the garage. He'd usually be the first to greet me, especially on a holiday. The silence from him was off-putting. "He'll come when he's ready," my mother replied, her voice carrying from the kitchen. "He had a big breakfast, so he can join us later. Let's go ahead and start." Something about her response didn't sit right. It wasn't like my dad to skip a Christmas meal, not for any reason. A small, insistent thought tugged at me. Maybe it was the book again, casting shadows over everything in my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "I'll just go say hello to him," I said, rising from the table. Before I'd even taken a step, she entered the dining room, carrying a large ham on an ornate silver platter. The meat was dark and glossy, almost blackened, the glaze thick and rich, coating every crisscrossed cut she'd made in the skin. The bone jutted out starkly from the center, pale against the charred flesh. "Sit down," she said, her voice oddly stern, a hint of irritation slipping through her usual holiday warmth. "This is a special meal. We should enjoy it together." I stopped, glancing from her to the closed door of the garage, the word "special meal" repeating in my head, setting off warning bells. Still, I stood my ground, my stomach churning. "I just want to see Dad, that's all. I haven't even said hello." Her face tensed, her grip tightening around the platter as her voice rose. "Sit down and enjoy lunch with me." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, like a command I was supposed to follow without question. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was lying just beneath the surface of her insistence. "No," I snapped, my voice echoing through the dining room. "I've had enough of this, Mom. You've been obsessed with that damn recipe book, and I'm done with it." My heart pounded as I looked at her, my words hanging thick in the silence, but I didn't back down. "I'm going to the garage to get Dad. We're putting an end to this right now." Her face contorted, desperation spilling from her eyes. "Please, just sit down," she pleaded, her voice cracking as she looked at the untouched plate in front of me. "Let's have this meal together. It's important." I took a step toward the garage, determined to get my dad out here, to make him see how far she'd gone. That book had wormed its way too deep into her mind. She shrieked and threw herself in front of the door, arms outstretched as if to block my path. Her face was flushed, her voice frantic. "Don't go in there. Please, just sit down. Enjoy the meal. Savor it," she begged, her hands trembling as she reached out, practically pleading. There was a desperation in her voice that sounded like fear, not just of me, but of what lay beyond that door. "Mom, you're acting crazy. We need to talk, and I need to see Dad." I tried to push past her, but she held her ground, her body a thin, shaky barrier. "Please," she whispered, voice thin and desperate. "You don't understand. Don't disturb him." "Dad," I called out, raising my voice over her pleas. Silence answered at first, followed by a muffled sound, a low, guttural moan, thick and unnatural, rising from the other side of the door. I froze, my blood turning cold as the sound slipped into a horrible, wet gurgle. My mother's face went white, her eyes wide with terror as she realized I'd heard him. I felt a surge of adrenaline take over, and before she could react, I shoved her aside and yanked open the door. The sight that met me would be seared into my memory forever. I stepped into the garage and froze, my stomach lurching at the scene before me. My dad lay sprawled across his workbench, his face pale and slick with sweat. His right leg was tied tightly with a belt just above the thigh, a makeshift tourniquet attempting to staunch the flow of blood. A pillowcase was wrapped around the raw, exposed flesh where his leg had been crudely severed, and blood pooled on the concrete floor beneath him, glistening in the cold, fluorescent light. He lifted his head weakly, his eyes glassy and unfocused. His mouth moved, trying to form words, a barely audible rasp escaping as he struggled to speak. "Help me." I didn't waste a second. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my fingers shaking so badly it was hard to hit the right buttons. My mother's shrill screams erupted from behind me as she lunged into the garage, her hands clawing at the air, pleading, "Stop, please, just sit down, just have lunch with me," she wailed, her voice high-pitched and frantic. Her face was twisted in desperation, tears streaming down her cheeks. But I didn't listen. I couldn't. I backed up, keeping a wide berth between her and my dad, and relayed the horror I was seeing to the dispatcher. "It's my dad. He's lost his leg. He's barely conscious," I stammered, voice cracking. "Please, you need to hurry." The dispatcher assured me that help was on the way, asking me to stay on the line, but my mother's desperate cries filled the garage, creating a haunting echo. She clutched at her head, her fingers digging into her scalp as she repeated, "Please, just come back to the table. Just eat. You have to eat." I kept my distance, heart pounding as I watched her spiral into a frantic haze. But she never laid a finger on me. She only circled back to the door, wailing and begging in a chilling frenzy that made my blood run cold. The police arrived within minutes, their lights flashing against the house, and rushed into the garage to assess the situation. My mother resisted, screaming and flailing as they restrained her, her pleas becoming incoherent sobs as they led her away. I could barely breathe as I watched them take her, her voice a haunting wail that echoed down the driveway, begging me to come back and join her at the table. Paramedics rushed in and began working on my dad, quickly stabilizing him and loading him onto a stretcher. I followed them outside, numb with shock, barely able to process the scene that had unfolded. In the frigid December air, my mind reeled, looping over her chilling words and the horrible sight in that garage. That Christmas, the warmth of family and familiarity had turned into something I could barely comprehend, twisted into a nightmare I would never forget. I stayed by my father's side every day at the hospital, watching over him as he slowly regained strength. On good days, when the painkillers were working and his mind was clearer, he told me everything he could remember about the last month with my mother. She'd been making strange, elaborate meals every single night since Thanksgiving, insisting he try each one. At first, he thought it was just a new holiday tradition, a way to honor Grandpa's recipes. But as the dishes grew more unusual, more disturbing, he realized something was deeply wrong. She had started mumbling to herself while she cooked, almost like she was speaking to someone who wasn't there. Eventually, he'd stopped eating at the house altogether, sneaking out for meals at nearby diners, finding any excuse he could to avoid her food. He even admitted that on Christmas morning, when he tried to leave, she had drugged his coffee. Everything went hazy after that, and the next thing he remembered was waking up to pain and the horror of what she'd done to his leg. We discussed the recipe book in hushed tones, both coming to the same terrible conclusion. The book had changed her. My father was hesitant to believe anything so sinister at first, but the memories of her frantic insistence, the look in her eyes, made him certain. Somehow, in some dark, twisted way, the book had drawn her into its thrall. By New Year's Eve, he was discharged from the hospital. I promised him I'd stay with him as he recovered, my own guilt over the role I'd unwittingly played gnawing at me. He accepted, his eyes carrying the quiet pain of someone forever altered. My mother, meanwhile, was undergoing evaluation in a psychiatric hospital. Since that Christmas, I hadn't seen her. I'd gotten updates from the doctors. They said she was calm, coherent, but that her words remained disturbing. She admitted to doing what she did to my father, repeating over and over, "We need to do what we must to survive the darkest days of the year." Her voice would drop to a whisper, a distant look in her eyes, as though the phrase were a sacred mantra. On New Year's Eve, as the minutes ticked toward midnight, my father and I went out to his backyard fire pit. I carried the recipe book, feeling its familiar weight in my hands one last time. Without a word, I tossed it into the fire, watching as the flames curled around the old leather, devouring the yellowed pages. It crackled and twisted in the heat, the recipes that had plagued us dissolving into ash. My father's hand on my shoulder was the only anchor I had as the smoke rose, dissipating into the cold night air. But as the last ember faded, I felt a pang of something like regret. Later, as I sat alone, staring at my computer, I hovered over the file on my desktop. The digital copy, each recipe scanned and preserved in perfect, chilling detail. I knew I should delete it, erase any trace of the book that had shattered my family. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I fear that it may have a hold on me. That was only the beginning. The next story takes terror to a whole new level. Jumping at shadows, I told Spencer that he was just jumping at shadows. He swore up and down that he wasn't. He insisted that those pills he took were keeping him safe. It sounded like a load of bull to me. It's killing you, is what it is, I told him while we were on break. I just watched him toss back more of that poison, and I couldn't in good conscience do it anymore. That's all those pharmaceuticals do. Do your research. It's a scam. That shit doesn't heal you. It's part of some fucked up eugenics program. I dunno. I'm better off with the pills, Spencer had said. Why? 'Cause some quack doctor said you did? Did you know they have one of the highest suicide rates? You want to know why that is? Because they can't really stomach what it is they do to people. They're sick people, Spence. Sick fucking people. Actually, it's more naturopathic, herbal. He sounded like he was making excuses. That's worse, I said. Look, our bodies are made to heal without that stuff. That's the real natural healing. Any medical process you can get, that's not natural. It doesn't help you. Not really. Be honest with me. What exactly is that stuff treating? Anxiety? Depression? Some other fake shit in your brain? No, not exactly, Spencer murmured. Look, we should really get back to work, Tony. In a minute. I want to know what you're taking them for. Spencer hesitated for a moment. I knew he didn't like being put on the spot, but this was literally for the good of his health. When I'm off the pills, I see things, he admitted. Shapes, people who aren't there, stuff like that. Doctor said it was a seizure or something. Judging by his tone, he knew it wasn't. Uh-huh. And what happens when you aren't on the pills, son? You see things? He nodded. Yeah. You ever consider that it's the withdrawal that makes you see things? I was seeing them before the pills, though. People experience all kinds of weird symptoms. It's 'cause of that shit they put in the water. It does things to people, and then Big Pharma just prescribes shit to keep the symptoms going. It's a psyop, trust me. He didn't look convinced, but I knew I could sway him. Tell you what, just try it. Yeah? Take a few days. Go without the pills. I guarantee you're going to be feeling better. You hear me? Guaranteed? I don't think that's smart. Spencer murmured, but I cut him off. Spence, have I ever steered you wrong? He knew I hadn't. In the year and a half that we'd been working together, he'd very quickly learned that I was always right. The bell sounded. Break time was over. We had a truck to unload. I noticed the next day, during our break, that Spencer didn't take his pills. Didn't even bring them to take them. Taking my advice, huh? I asked as I took a sip of water. Trying it, he said. It would be nice if I didn't have to take them. They do mess with my head a little, make it harder to think clearly. See, now you're getting it, I said, and clapped him on the shoulder. Attaboy. He nodded shyly, offering me a meek little smile. Yeah, well, I guess that naturopathic doctor was a little weird. She had sorta a new age vibe to her. I scoffed. Course she did. Let me tell you something, Spence. There's some real fucking freaks out there. The smartest thing you can do is not to trust them. Me? There's one man I trust and one alone, and that's Jesus Christ. Greatest American who ever lived. Jesus Christ wasn't an American, Spencer tried to say, but I cut him off. You gotta get in with the right crowd of people, Spence. Trust me. The right people are gonna save you in every way you can be saved. He didn't answer, but I'll bet he knew I was right. I was always right. Spencer was a good kid, and I'd taken a liking to him ever since he'd started working with us about a month ago. He lived with his mom, his dad had passed when he was a kid, and he wasn't great with social interaction, but he was a good kid. He had goals. He wanted to make something of his life. He wanted to save up money to go to college. It was kinda a waste if you ask me. Nobody I know ever actually got a real job from a college degree. but I was sure I could probably talk some sense into him, given enough time. He was a hard worker, and that was what mattered. Spencer was young. He was allowed to be a little bit of a dumbass, and the way I saw it, it was my job to help him. I'd been around the block long enough to know just how much of what we think of as reality is just some fucked up performance put on by the elites, trying to keep us numb to the realities of their depravity. I'd been trying to educate him during our shifts together. Most folks didn't want to take the blinders off, but Spencer was a smart kid. He knew how to listen. The lunch bell sounded. I sighed and got up. "Ah, back to it, Spence," I said as I packed up my lunch bag. He nodded and followed me back to the loading dock. We'd had another truck come in over lunch, and that was going to take over our entire afternoon. As we worked, I ended up doing most of the talking, along with the bulk of the heavier lifting. Spencer was a hard worker, but he was a scrawny little thing who hadn't yet built up the muscle he was going to need for this job. He was good at packing and wrapping the skids, though, so he pulled his own weight. Well, usually pulled his own weight. I didn't notice it at first because I was so busy talking and going back and forth from the truck, but Spence seemed a little distracted. As I brought back another box, I noticed him standing by a nearby full skid, staring off into some vacant corner of the warehouse. "You all good, buddy?" I asked, and he jumped a little bit when I spoke. "Oh, yeah, I'm good. Sorry, I didn't take last night's dosage or this morning's dosage either, so I'm starting to get a little out of it." I gave him a nod. "Ah, withdrawal, huh? You need a water break?" "No, I'm good to keep going," he insisted, trying not to glance at the empty corner of the warehouse he'd been staring in. I set the box I was carrying on the skid and let him wrap it while I went and grabbed a new pallet. As I did, I caught myself glancing over into the corner he'd been staring in. It was empty. I dunno what I expected to see there, although, nah, there wasn't any movement there. The other loading team had no reason to be over there, so whatever I'd thought I'd seen peeking out from behind one of those skids was obviously just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe I needed to change the filter on my water purifier back home. That was probably it. I shrugged the whole thing off and got back to work. Spencer seemed to be doing the same, although he still seemed a bit on edge. When Spencer came in the next day, the poor bastard looked rough. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his short brown hair looked a little more unkempt than usual. "Withdrawal kicking your ass, huh?" I'd asked him as we opened up our first truck of the day. "Just couldn't sleep," he murmured. Kept seeing things last night. It got so bad that I almost went and got the pills, but you're fighting through it, huh?" He gave a half nod. "I mean, whatever I'm seeing can't be real, right? It's just, I don't know, some sort of visual hallucination. And I feel fine, better than I usually do. Clearer head, it's just, every time I look up, there's something standing at the edge of my bed." I gave a sympathetic nod. "Man, they've really got you fried on something, huh?" I asked. "Yeah, haven't told my parents I've cut the medication yet. They'd just give me shit for it. But I don't want to be on those pills for my entire life. Damn right, 'cause you know that shit ain't good for you." He nodded back at me, but didn't seem to reply. I caught him staring at that same corner again. "You seeing shit right now, Spence?" I asked. "Yeah, it's fine. I know it's not real. It's just hard to ignore it. It's all right, detoxifying is an intense fucking process. When'd you start seeing these things anyway?" As we talked, I tried to direct his attention back to the job at hand. "About a year ago," he said. "Took a bad fall during a hiking trip. I was lost for, I don't know, a night or so. I started seeing those things while I was alone in the woods. Eventually, I managed to get out, but I just kept seeing them. Things got rough. We started to pack our first skid." "No kidding, huh? You hit your head or something?" "Yeah, I must have," Spencer murmured. "Been seeing those shadows ever since. Wow, would have thought a concussion would have healed by now." "That's what I would have thought. But," Spencer gave a shrug, "there's a shadowy figure standing at the back of the truck who's telling me otherwise." I caught myself glancing over at the truck. I saw nothing. "It's just in my head," Spencer said, more for himself than anything else. "That's right, man. And you just got to give yourself time to heal. You're doing everything right." He just nodded absent-mindedly, as if he wasn't entirely sure. but I knew he'd stay on the straight and narrow. We got through the truck without any incidents, although Spencer was still clearly a little out of it. I figured he just needed a few more days to get his bearings, and he'd be right as rain. Better than before. I knew it for a fact. It was a few days after he'd quit his medication that things took a hard turn south. He'd been on edge those past few days, still complaining that he wasn't sleeping. I'd told him that things would get better. I knew it as a fact. But those bags under his eyes got darker every day, and eventually, while we were working, he just started screaming. I'd been wrapping one of the skids when I heard it from inside the truck. Howls of terror that I would have expected to hear from a man being fucking murdered. I ran into the truck to see what the hell was going on, and almost crashed into Spencer as he stumbled out of the truck, almost on all fours, his eyes wild with panic. "It's coming," he screeched. "It's coming for me." I told him to calm the fuck down. Tried to hold him in place, but he fought me, desperately trying to run away. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he screamed until his voice sounded hoarse. Some of the other guys in the warehouse had come by to check in on him, and a couple of them even needed to help keep him down. Spencer fought like a man possessed, screaming about how they were getting closer. The boss ended up calling him an ambulance, despite my recommendation that we just let this pass, and when they loaded Spencer in, I watched him fight against his restraints, sobbing and trying to scream, although his voice didn't seem to be working anymore. That was the last time I saw Spencer Allen, sobbing and trying to scream, being loaded into the back of that ambulance. I'm told he didn't even make it to the hospital. Although I don't know exactly what happened to him on the way there, and I can't even begin to guess. What I do know is that when that ambulance drove away and the boss told us to get back to work, I saw someone standing in the truck that Spencer had been unloading. At first, I thought that it was another one of the guys. Maybe the boss had sent someone else my way to cover for Spencer since he was gone. But whoever they weren't working. They were just standing there in the darkness. I stared at them for a moment, trying to figure out who they were. And then they looked up at me. I'd never felt my blood turn to ice before that moment. But those eyes, those fucking eyes, they had a shine to them. The same kind of shine you see in a cat's eyes, in the dark. It was that shine that told me that whatever I was looking at wasn't a person. I knew that in my gut, even though I didn't want to accept it right away. When I blinked, the figure was gone, and I wondered if maybe this whole thing had just been my imagination. But I've seen them again since. Usually they come at night, but whenever it's dark, I'll see them. They're never in plain sight. They're always off to the side, always watching from the shadows with those shining cat's eyes of theirs. They used to be quick to disappear, but not anymore. No, now they're staying longer. Now they're getting closer. Now there's more of them. I've checked. Nobody else can see them. They don't show up on cameras either. It's like they're not even there, but I can still fucking see them. I don't know what they are. I don't know why they're coming for me now. Is it because I was close to Spencer? Because I told him to stop with his meds? Is that it? I wish I knew. I don't know what to do to stop this. I've tried to pray, but I don't think God is listening to me anymore. Or I hope he's not listening to me, because I don't want to think about the alternatives. You might want to leave the lights on for this next one. It only gets darker from here. I followed the creek bed near my house and saw something unnatural. I live in a rural part of central Texas, down a dirt road a few miles off the highway. I'm on a 40-acre tract of land, mostly pasture for grazing cattle. My nearest neighbor is about a mile away, and past him the road dips down into a wooded area. If you follow the road down another mile from there, a solid concrete bridge with wide metal culverts crosses over a creek. About a week ago, I was taking a walk down the country road to clear my head. It may be October, but down here in Texas, temperatures are still pushing 90 degrees, and we haven't had more than a few drops of rain all month. As you might expect, when I got to the bridge, the creek was nearly dry. A small stream of water still flowed down the very center of the creek bed, but the rest of the channel was exposed, the clay beginning to crack from lack of rainfall. Ducking under the guardrail, I hopped down off the bridge to the surface of the creek, and started heading upstream. The creek was fully shaded by live oaks and sycamores, and the banks were lined with scrub brush. Down inside the bed, wood fern and brookweed lay exposed and dried from lack of water, and tree roots weaved in and out of the clay. I took in the sights of nature, mainly focusing on my footing, and felt my stress melt away. Coming around a bend in the creek a solid mile from the bridge, I noticed a buck in the distance, drinking from the small trickle of water that still flowed. I froze, trying to make as little noise as possible to avoid spooking him. I quietly reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone to snap a photo. I zoomed in and worked to get the distant image into focus. He must have been around 4 or 5 years old, judging from the size of the rack and broad, muscular body. At last, the focus came through, but while I tried to take the picture, I froze. Instead of the white fur I expected to see on the underside of the mouth of a deer this size, I saw red. Panning down, I saw that he wasn't drinking water at all. Hanging from the sharp, clearly non-herbivorous teeth were bits of fat and sinew, as the animal tore through the fresh carcass of a bobcat. As I stared, stunned by what I was seeing, I shifted slightly and a twig snapped under my foot. The buck's head snapped to attention, his black beady eyes staring directly at me. To my horror, it stood up on its hind legs and began to walk towards me. I turned and ran. My legs burned and my lungs heaved as I sprinted downstream. Behind me, I heard a high-pitched shriek, almost like a woman, which morphed and deepened into a feral roar in a sick glissando. In terror of what was behind me, I looked back over my shoulder, tripping over a tree root in the process. I tumbled forward, skinning my arm and landing painfully on my back. In a frenzy, I swung my head in every direction, terrified of the creature's pursuit. Not seeing it, I struggled to my feet and took off back home. Nearing the bridge, I heard a horrible laughter coming from behind the tree line. Like a pack of coyotes, but slower and lower pitched. Dumb with fear, I scrambled up the concrete of the bridge, hitting my head against the metal guard. Heedless of my now bleeding forehead, I continued my desperate escape back down the road towards my house. Finally, leaving the tree line and nearing my house, I felt my body dump the excess adrenaline, and the pain from my fall and collision with the guardrail came in full force. Exhausted, I limped my way the last bit home, bolting the door behind me. That was last week. Every night since then, I've woken up in the middle of the night. I'm a light sleeper, but usually in the country, there isn't much noise to wake me. Coyotes, sometimes a car driving down the dirt road. But this is neither. Every night, waking from sleep, I hear a voice whisper my name. When I get up and go to the window to investigate, I can barely make out a dark shadow by the tree line and a faint, awful laughter. If you think you've heard it all, this next story will make you question everything. Father Michael, I love being a teacher. Waking up every morning and seeing all my students is the highlight of my days. Each student is very different from one another, and I'm not going to lie, there are certain students I do favor over the others. I have one student with whom I bond the most. She always arrives to class on time and looks very put together. She doesn't wear baggy hoodies and pajamas like the other kids. Her hair always falls perfectly with her curls neatly tamed. She always says thank you and tells me to have a good day at the end of each class. Heather is just a role model student. Every teacher wishes for students like her. Today I went to the teacher's lounge like every other day to eat lunch. I switched who I sat with very frequently because they all tend to get boring fast. Today I sat with Mrs. Crow, a young, newer teacher. She began talking to me about how she's engaged and showing me pictures of her fiancé. "Are you seeing anyone?" she asked. "No." I responded, not trying to entertain this conversation. She leans towards me, touching my shoulder. "Don't worry, I'm sure you'll meet someone soon. When you know, or at least that's what happened with my boyfriend, I mean fiancé," she said, letting out an obnoxious laugh. "Have you been in any recent relationships?" "Sorry, I'm just so nosy. Just excited to get to know my new coworkers," she said while playfully punching my shoulder. "I was married, but things didn't end very well after she cheated on me," I responded, unsure why I told her that. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she responds while covering her mouth with her hands. After she let me get a few words in, she continued talking about herself. I sat there pretending to listen, while reminiscing about my past relationship while it's now on my mind. I started to feel myself getting angry. Then I remembered some coping techniques I learned from my support group. I got up and walked away, trying to contain myself from saying something I'll regret. After school, a few students stayed to make up a quiz. I always bring snacks and drinks for the students. I find it helps them do better. After about 30 minutes, there was only one student left. "Are you sure you don't want some soda? It's the last one left," I asked while reaching for the Sprite. "I guess it won't hurt," she responded. I cracked open the soda and slipped a pill in there while she was too focused to notice. I hand her the soda and she continues working. Already I'm all done. I grabbed her quiz while I asked, "You were absent Tuesday, right?" She nods her head yes. I walk towards my desk, pretending to look for the graded quizzes. "It looks like I left them in my car. I could give it to you if you don't mind walking there with me." "Sure, I've got nowhere else to be," she exclaimed. We step out of the classroom and start heading towards the side door. I look down at her and see the top of her head with her bunny hair clips, barely reaching my shoulders. She's so cute and small. I just want to pick her up. We finally reach my car and I unlock the door. I open the door and accidentally drop my keys. They're right on the seat neck. "If you want to start looking for your quiz," I stated while bending down to grab the keys. As she reaches into the car, I push her as hard as I can. Her backpack flips over her head, forcing her into my car. Am I really doing this right now? At school? I slammed the door and drove away as quickly as possible. She started to yell and bang on the windows. Thank God for my investment into tinted windows. She started reaching up towards me and covering my eyes. I grabbed my coffee mug and hit her in the head. I didn't want to hurt her, but she left me no choice. After about 10 minutes of me fighting with her while trying to drive at the same time, she finally collapsed onto her side. I pull into my garage and think about how to get her inside. I guess I could just carry her. She's small, right? I step inside to make sure there's no one home. "Hello?" I asked. "Hey, how was work?" my sister responded. "Really good," I responded, not trying to show my panic. "I've just got a lot of work to do. I'll be downstairs." "Do you have your group meeting tonight?" she asked. "No, tomorrow morning, I think," I responded while trying to sit Heather up. I finally get a good grip on her and slowly carry her through the garage door and down the basement stairs. I've done something similar to this before, but I still couldn't help stressing. My sister never comes down here because this is technically my part of the house. I pay for the basement, and she knows I don't like when people mess with my stuff. I always lock the door, and she just never bothers me. It's kind of an unspoken agreement we have. I gently place Heather on the floor. She's so pretty when she's sleeping. I go into my workshop and grab an old chain and lock I've had. I don't want to do this, Heather, but I have to, at least until I can explain what she's done wrong. I sit on the couch and accidentally doze off. I finally wake up after about what felt like 5 hours and look over to the floor. She's still lying there. I checked my phone, and it's been almost an hour. When will she wake up? She's been passed out for over 2 hours now. I didn't think it'd last this long. My stress has been getting in the way of my excitement, but I'm eager now. I can't wait to see her journey. The basement of my house isn't very nice, but I hope she won't mind. I have a special surprise for her. There's one other room down here, and I've spent almost a whole year renovating. I didn't know I'd be getting it ready for her at first, but as time went on, I realized how perfect she'd be to bring to Father Michael. I tore out the wooden panel walls and painted them pink. All girls like pink. I hope she likes it. I remember this one shirt that Heather would wear often. It was skin tight with a little bunny on the right side. Sometimes when she'd stretch in class, her shirt would roll up and I could see her belly piercing poking out. I bought her a bunny stuffed animal because of this shirt. I hope she likes that too. I lay on the couch impatiently, thinking about how excited she's going to be for my surprise. As I'm laying there, I hear a quiet sound. "Hello." This didn't sound like Heather. Heather had a loud, strong voice. My heart started to beat uncontrollably fast. What should I say? Do I sit up? Do I go up to her? I started to panic. I have to respond soon. I got up and stood behind the couch. I wanted to go to her. Tell her everything's gonna be okay. Once she sees her surprise, I know she's gonna be thankful. Hey, Heather. That's all that I could say. What am I doing? Why did I only say that? She responded very quickly, asking where we were. I didn't know what to tell her. Her new home? She started freaking out and kicking her leg, realizing she's chained. I hate this part. Last time I made the mistake of bringing someone a little younger. She wasn't as mature. When I brought her here, she had whined and cried for hours. I hope Heather isn't like that. It's okay. I've got a surprise for you. I unchain her leg and guide her to her new bedroom. Do you like it? She never responded. You don't like it, I said, trying not to show my frustration. No, I don't. I'm not staying here. I don't know what the fuck is wrong with you and why you brought me here. She yelled. I don't like being yelled at. She should know that. No one does. Father Michael says that no woman should raise their voice at a man, and that they must be punished to learn. I push her onto the bed and tie her arms and legs to the end of the bed posts. Look, Heather, I don't want to do this, but people need to be punished so they can learn to never do that again. You understand that, right? I would never want to intentionally hurt you if I didn't have to. It's Father Michael's rules. You'll understand when you meet him. She started to yell, which just made me more angry. I cover her mouth so she can't make any noise. I started thinking about how unloyal and sneaky she was, which made me act on my anger. I go into my bathroom and grab a pair of scissors. I slowly cut into her toenail. I started pushing closer and closer to her skin, trying to take up the whole nail. She started moving her legs. She was resisting. The only good thing I could think about when having a younger girl is that she was smaller, easier to tame. After only successfully ripping off 3 toenails, I stopped. I put the now chipped nail polish toenails into my pocket. I'm never going to really see her feet, so I don't mind damaging them. Now, do you understand why you can't be rude? People have feelings, and you hurt mine. She nodded in agreement. I sat in the chair in front of her bed. I just wanted to watch her. I didn't like watching her struggle, but I liked seeing how much she was going to change tomorrow. I decided I'm going to take her to Michael's tomorrow. Last time I brought the other girl, Beth, but he didn't like her. I hope he likes Heather as much as I do. You better get some sleep. Tomorrow's a big day, I told her. I watched her as she fell asleep. She looks so peaceful. I wake up from the sun shining through the corner of my window. I look at Heather. She's awake. I check my phone and it's 9:30 a.m. I better start getting her ready. I opened the closet and grabbed the nicely hung outfit and placed it on the bed. A flowy white dress with a pair of red flats. I'm gonna untie you now, but you must behave. You know how I feel about being disrespected. I slowly untie the knots I made at the top of the headboard. Once I'm done, she sits up. She hasn't looked at me since last night. Now I'm going to turn around while you put this on, okay? I asked. She nods yes while staring at the floor. After about 5 minutes, I heard a whisper. It's on, I said out loud, the only thing that had come to my mind. Whoa. I grab Heather's wrist and start heading up the stairs, turning the corner to see if my sister's car is here. It's not. Heather hasn't said anything in a while. I hope she's not sad. I lead her into the car and wrap rope around her and the seat just to be safe. I put tape over her mouth and got into the driver's seat. The drive to see Father Michael's group is around 25 minutes. On the way, we passed through the desert and closer to the mountains. Heather remained calm. As we finally arrive, I pull into Michael's driveway. I get out of the car and open Heather's door. Before I could even get her untied, I turned around and saw Michael standing right behind me. You startled me, Father Michael. How have you been, John? I missed you, he says to me. Good, happy to be back. Well, look at that, she's gorgeous, he says, well, patting me on my back. The group's all inside, eager to start, he exclaimed. He reaches into the car and starts stroking her hair. I'm happy he likes her. We pick her up and bring her into the back room. The back room is a big open space that Father Michael has dedicated to our group meetings. Along the walls are pictures of our family, all 63 of us. It's kind of crazy to think that this started with just 12 of us. Now our family's grown. We place her in the middle of the room. The other members are all here and ready to begin. Now, if everyone could thank John for bringing this lovely lady. Father Michael states while clapping. He's such a good guy. He makes me feel proud of myself. I can tell he really cares about us. Everyone is looking around on the edge of their seats, antsy to begin. I look at Heather, and I can tell she's starting to freak out. Her hands are fidgeting behind her back, trying to release herself. Now, as you all know, we've had 10 new members join this past month. This is their first times at a ceremony, so we're going to take things slowly, says Father Michael. Heather starts freaking out more and manages to roll over. This interrupts Father Michael and makes him angry. He walks towards her and stomps on her hand while telling her to be quiet. He picks her up and puts her back, sitting up in the seat. He grabs her face and rips the tape off, allowing her to speak. She sits there quietly with tears running down her eyes. Now, Heather, why don't you tell everyone why you're here? I don't know, she stutters. Come on now, that's not true. John told me about your friend Alex. Father Michael states while walking in a circle around her. My boyfriend? She asks. So you do know why you're here? No, she says while sobbing. We know what you did. John, why don't you go and explain to the group how it happened this time? I never got to share a story before. Most of the other members work in very different environments, so they tend to have more run-ins with situations like this. I stood up and turned to the group. I caught Heather being unfaithful to her boyfriend. I could see everyone's faces mixed with anger and excitement. Now, do you know how hurtful that is? How would you like it if someone cheated on you? Michael asked while his voice got increasingly louder. Heather remained silent. You know, I was cheated on after 5 years of marriage while having 2 kids. I love when Michael tells this story. Do you think that's fair? Do you? No, but Heather started to say with tears rolling down her face before being interrupted by Father Michael. I hate to see Heather upset, but he's right. I was cheated on 3 years ago and it was awful. Women really can't just be loyal, can they? Not even for family? It's honestly disgusting. Now, although you've made a mistake, we're giving you another chance. You get to be our wife, Michael said as all of us started clapping and cheering. I'm happy this is working out. Last time, when I brought Beth, there had been a mix-up. I'm friends with her father and had walked in on them kissing. I knew that wasn't right because he was married. When I brought her here and explained it to Father Michael, he got very angry with me. He told me that this time it wasn't the girl's fault. It was too late, though. I felt bad, but how was I supposed to know? He made an exception, and we had trained her to be the perfect wife. She was doing great at first, but then things took a turn. We let her use the bathroom alone after 3 months of earning our trust, and she had slit her wrists. We were all very sad because this was our second wife we had lost. We've been sharing one wife with all of us, but now that we have new members, we decided we needed someone else. I reached my hand in my pocket and started playing with her toenails from the night before. Heather, don't worry. This isn't your fault that you were born this way, but we're here to help you now. Father Michael grabs her chair and drags her into a connected room. We all form a line and get ready to take our turns. It's finally my turn, and I walk up holding a surprise behind my back. I brought you a stuffed animal bunny. I remembered how you liked them. Just when you thought it was safe, the next tale is even more disturbing. Something got into the walls. I want to tell you about the worst thing that's ever happened to me. The thing that has haunted me for almost 20 years, and which has completely and irreparably ruined my relationship with my older brother Marcus. If he finds this post, he'll probably break his decade-long silence to scream at me about it all, but I don't care. This isn't just his story, it's mine too. It was a hot summer during the mid-2000s, and me, my mom, and Marcus lived in a nondescript Midwestern town. I had just turned 7 and spent most of my days bugging Marcus, trying to get him to play with me. Marcus was 17 and had absolutely no interest in spending time with his little brother. He spent most of his days locked in his room, trying to ignore my incessant whining and pleading. Mom was a school teacher and therefore had her summer break too. The job really didn't pay well, and we were only kept afloat by Marcus's dad, occasionally paying child support. My dad hadn't spoken a word to my mom since they parted ways after a one-night stand, and to this day, I don't know if he's even alive. Due to Mom's meager income, the house we lived in wasn't great. Don't get me wrong, it seemed huge to me as a child, and it was better than the dingy apartment we had lived in just a few years earlier. But there was a reason why the rent was so cheap. The details of my childhood home kind of blur together, but I can remember water damage, mold, drafty rooms, and lousy heating. I've tried to ask Marcus for details a few times, but he's refused to help me out. I'm not surprised. It was during that hot summer, when the days were sweltering and the heat never seemed to really leave even during the night, that the scratching started. At first it wasn't much. An ever so gentle, almost tap-like scratch on the east wall in Mom's room. My room was next to hers, and sometimes the scratching would move over there to right above my bed. It didn't scare me. As a 7-year-old child, it was almost a little comforting in the dead of night. But Mom, of course, didn't like it. She figured it was either rats or mice living there, which was bad, or some other critter that had gotten stuck, which was worse. We didn't have enough money for an exterminator, so Mom prayed it was the first option and put out some traps. We waited for a while. Nothing even touched the traps. Mom swore every time she checked them, and nothing came up. A week or so passed, and still nothing. The scratching stopped, rather abruptly, and we all hoped it was over. But soon enough, the smell came. A weak smell that just barely lingered in Mom's room at first, but that slowly grew in intensity. It never got too strong and was mostly centered in Mom's room, but it was unpleasant nonetheless. Mom swore even more, and Marcus left his room even less. I assume Mom wanted us out of the house while she got rid of whatever had died in the wall. That's why she sent us to Aunt Monica overnight. Aunt Monica was nice enough, a bit awkward with children, but kind-hearted and sweet. She bought us McDonald's for dinner and let me and my brother stay up late watching movies. We went back late the next afternoon and came home to an empty house. The door was unlocked, but Mom was nowhere to be found. I got worried, but Marcus calmed me down. She was probably out shopping or running errands or something. That night, the scratching returned. It was still soft, and it lulled me to sleep. Mom wasn't back the next day. Marcus just shrugged and said, "Well, when is she ever home?" The scratching was a little louder that night. Still quiet and cozy, but I couldn't stop thinking about Mom. Truth be told, she did leave us alone overnight, or sometimes for a few days. Marcus was old enough to care for me, so that wasn't really a concern. But still, I worried about her. I think it was during day 2 or 3 that we could hear the scratching during the day. It was like an odd mix of scratching and the occasional tapping, and it moved between Mom's room, my room, and the living room. "Goddamn mice!" Marcus cursed and gave the wall a hard kick. The weak wall gave a crunch and a small indent formed. The scratching stopped momentarily before continuing more to the left. Marcus swore and made me promise not to tell Mom he broke the wall. That night, the scratching stopped being comforting. It was louder, harder, and more intense somehow. I tried to convince Marcus to let me sleep in his room, but he slammed the door in my face. I woke up the next day to a foul smell wafting into my room. It was like the smell from earlier had gotten stronger and more potent. I went into the kitchen to see Marcus trying to call someone, who clearly wasn't picking up. He looked strange to my 7-year-old self. He looked almost scared. When I walked in, his face hardened and he tried to put on a brave face, but I'd seen him. And it worried me more than anything else. The next couple of days were hellish, and it only got worse and worse. The heat was cooking us alive. That incessant scratching and scraping wouldn't stop, and you could hear it everywhere. At night, it almost sounded like someone was banging on my bedroom wall. And when Marcus came rushing in after he heard my crying, he relented and let me sleep in his bed. The stench also got stronger. It was a horrid, rotten stench that permeated the whole house, seemingly coming from the hole in the wall. It got so bad I couldn't walk past without gagging, and I saw Marcus dry heave after covering the hole with duct tape. That did help a little with the smell. A week had passed and Mom was still gone. The scraping and scratching could be heard at all hours, and the stench was almost too much to handle. The house had no AC, and I was wet with sweat in the early noon. I was sitting on the couch in the living room trying to watch some TV to distract from the sounds. I occasionally glanced at the taped-up hole, thinking about if Mom would be angry about it when she got back. That's when I saw it. Movement. Under the tape, I froze. It couldn't be. No, I must have imagined it, obviously. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. Again, I felt my stomach clench. Something definitely shifted under the thin layer of tape. I gasped when I saw something small push itself under the tape and wriggle downwards. Something pale and shiny peeked out from under the edge of the tape, before falling to the floor and laying there writhing. More movement. More small shapes under the tape. I screamed. Marcus came rushing in, wielding a crowbar. He stared at me in confusion, probably expecting some sort of monstrosity to be attacking me. I pointed at the hole in horror. He looked and let out a choked sound. Maybe 5 or 6 small white worms lay wriggling on the floor, and more were forcing themselves out from under the tape. Something flashed in my brother's eyes, a mix of horror, disgust, and pure rage. He stomped over to the wall, crushing the maggots under his shoes. The scratching had grown in intensity. It sounded like something was trying to tear down the wall. "Fuck you, goddamn son of a bitch." Marcus yelled and swung the crowbar right into the wall. It wasn't hard enough, but it made a small hole and the house screamed. He swung again, harder, burying it deep, and tore it out. Pieces of wall, debris, and dust rained over him. He swung again, tearing out more wall. A loud rumble shook the house, stopping him dead in his tracks. All was silent, and Marcus began slowly backing up. A buzzing black mass spewed out of the wall. What seemed to be hundreds, thousands of flies flowed almost like a wave out of the hole, causing Marcus and I to drop to the floor to avoid the flood of buzzing, screaming insects. They moved like one singular organism, flying around the room whilst more and more spewed out of the hole with such force it tore the wall apart, making the hole wider. I was crying. I think Marcus was too. We lay there, huddled together as the assault continued. At some point, the buzzing quieted. It didn't stop, but it settled down a bit. I dared a peek at the scenery. Every single fly had settled on the ceiling, forming a thick black carpet above us. But what drew my attention was the wall. The hole in the wall was now almost as big as I was, and the smell that wafted out was unbearable. My eyes teared up and I had to swallow down bile as my nostrils were assaulted by the foulest, most horrific stench I had ever experienced. Besides, the low buzzing above us all was quiet, and that scared me more than the scratching. I knew there was something in the wall. The flies hadn't been the ones scratching and tapping. Marcus knew this too. He got to his feet and slowly approached the wall. No. I wanted to scream at him. Leave it alone. Don't disturb it. I couldn't make a sound though, more scared of disturbing the ominous quiet. Marcus was almost at the wall when a creak from inside made him stop. A creaking of wood or joints or something else entirely. It quieted down again, and he almost started getting closer when something large and dark tumbled out of the hole and landed with a grotesque crack. It took me a moment to comprehend the swollen, discolored shape covered in wriggling white shapes, but when I understood, I screamed. I screamed and screamed and screamed until something tore and all I got out were gasping sobs. Marcus had fallen to his knees, vomiting and staring wide-eyed at the shape. A small cascade of white maggots followed it, as well as undefinable larger shapes with fur and teeth. I collapsed at some point, and the last thing I remember before hitting my head are wide black eye sockets and a mouth twisted into a horrific screech. I remember the following weeks and months as a terrible mess of police officers, doctors' offices, and Aunt Monica's house. We were questioned again and again and again. I know they were particularly hard on Marcus. How was Mom before it all happened? Did she leave us often? Why didn't we contact anyone? As a small child, I couldn't answer these questions. I just did as Marcus did. I think there was even a case brought against him for endangering me when he was responsible for me, but it never went anywhere. I never learned exactly what happened. Aunt Monica kept me very well sheltered against the horrors of the press. But even from what little I know, it seems like the police don't know either. How'd she get there? Why did she go there? I know me and my brother's account of the continued knocking and scratching was especially questioned, as the stage of decomposition was rather far advanced in the summer heat. Marcus once told me when he was very drunk that her neck was broken, and she was stone cold dead when we got home that first day. Speaking of Marcus, him and I drifted apart almost as soon as he moved out from Aunt Monica's at 19. I attempted to keep in contact for a couple of years, but he was clearly affected by all of this differently than I was. He has distanced himself from all that reminds him of it, and now we haven't spoken in more than a decade. I miss him, but I understand it to some degree. The memories hurt. It hurts so much. Therapy hasn't helped. No one can understand what it's like to see what I saw. I don't expect you people to do either. But it's nice to share it. Nice to be heard. Won't stop the nightmares, though. Nothing can. I doubt I'll ever be able to sleep a full night's sleep again. If your heart's still racing, you might want to brace yourself for what's coming next. I discovered something grotesque in the archives of the university I work at, and I don't think it wanted to be found, because it got personal really fast. The university's archives were a chaotic, neglected treasure trove. Decades of research papers, recorded lectures, and historical artifacts were scattered across ancient hard drives and outdated computers. No one had bothered to organize it, let alone back it up, until recently. It wasn't just academic work stored down there. Some of it was irreplaceable. Rare interviews, field recordings, and data from long-gone professors that could never be replicated. The panic didn't set in until a few of the older drives failed, and they realized that years of irreplaceable knowledge could disappear with a single corrupted file. I had worked at the university for a while, mostly on routine tasks, but when the urgency of saving the archives became clear, my supervisor handed me the task. They needed someone to go down into the basement storage and catalog every computer, every hard drive, and transfer all the data to a secure online server. It seemed straightforward, though overwhelming in scale. But the moment I stepped into the basement, an odd, windowless labyrinth with flickering fluorescent lights, I knew something was off. The space felt strangely disconnected from the campus above, like it belonged to another time, another world. Each room was crammed with old equipment, reel-to-reel tape machines, dusty computers, forgotten research equipment, all piled haphazardly over the years. I set up a small workstation in the first room, using an old desk covered in obsolete electronics, and began methodically searching through the clutter. As I moved from room to room over the course of several days, I felt an unsettling shift in the air. The deeper I went into the basement, the darker and more claustrophobic it became. And then I started working on the last computer, and it just would not open. I tried everything, and I mean everything, until frustration came rushing in, and I just hit the unit really bad. And it cracked. At first I panicked. Then I noticed something, gray sticking out, an USB drive jammed inside a unit? How could that even work? Why would someone put it there? Were they hiding it? I connected it to a random computer, expecting nothing, but there it was, a folder on the desktop labeled Restart. Inside, a single audio file. I hit play, white noise. I connected external speakers, still nothing but a cold hiss. I copied the folder to my main computer. When I opened it again, there were 2 files, and both played songs. Each time I transferred the folder to a different computer, more songs appeared. The music was strange, unsettling, and the more I listened, the more it twisted something deep inside. The songs felt wrong, like they shouldn't exist. I tried not to think about it, tried to ignore the creeping sense of dread, but the songs wouldn't let me. They multiplied, shifting and warping. The files from the unaccounted-for USB drive have parasitically attached themselves to my life over the last few days, and have taken up most of my time and attention. With the way things have been going, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little scared. I haven't listened to much else, despite being a prolific music listener and audiophile all of my life. I've developed a kind of obsession with these songs. I've come to know them like the back of my hand. Well, more or less. I came to know the lyrics, structure, instrumentation, arrangement, etc. of each song, and that's given way to a series of dizzying problems. Going back to my previous post, I mentioned how on first listen while in the basement, I had a strong feeling that there was something wrong with the songs. I don't just mean with the strange behavior of the files, but with the music itself. It really came off as ominous and threatening. Naturally, I assumed that becoming familiar with them, I would gradually outgrow those feelings. The opposite has happened. I mean, I did eventually overcome my fear of the music itself. In fact, I find it to be quite profound and interesting. But something else is wrong. I honestly don't know how to write about this in a way that comes off as reasonable, so I'll just write it as it has happened and let it stagger you the same way it did to me. The songs are changing in multiple ways. It all started with trivial lyric changes that I chalked up to memory distortion. At first, I would notice how one word would change for another that sounded very similar to it, etc. I obviously thought that I clearly had not listened to the lyrics carefully enough, that perhaps I was mistaking the song structure. But then, it started to become clear that something really wrong was happening. Entire lines would change. At first, the lyrics of one verse would swap with another, but eventually I was listening to completely new words that I knew for sure were not initially there. I tried to convince myself that it was just me, and that the mysterious origin of the files was feeding into my perception of them. I needed to gain some clarity. I made a few notes regarding simple empirical things that could be known about the songs. I wrote down the lyrics for each song, as well as their root key and length. I first started to notice varying lengths in the files when I went for a run that always takes me 40 minutes to complete. By then, I knew without question that the full length of the project ran 38 minutes in total. When I reached the end of my run, the project was still running. It went on for a full 7 minutes longer than possible, clocking in at 45 minutes. I checked the time to confirm the phenomenon, and it was 100% due to variations of time in the songs. Then, bigger changes began to happen. Entire structural changes were occurring within the songs. Verses and choruses were being switched around, and arrangements played by specific instruments were being replaced with others, along with general differences in tonality, sometimes by as little as a quarter tone to as drastic as a couple of whole tones. Recently, I clocked a song running for a full 13 minutes when I had recorded its length at just under 5 minutes. How can it be possible that the musical content of these files is changing? I haven't even mentioned what is the most unnatural and terrifying thing about this whole affair. The content of the lyrics seems to be aware of who I am, what I am doing, and what I am thinking. I don't want to include too many details about my personal life, but I'll say that throughout my life, I have had a very difficult relationship with a particular member of my family, and that 2 days ago I had a falling out with this person that was way more destructive and toxic than any previous one. There have been many, but this may truly be the last. In as few words as possible, I went through something unspeakable for many years during my childhood, and this family member revealed that they knew exactly what was going on and did nothing to help. After this confrontation, I came home in a daze. I felt like my mind and body were going to give out. I've been sober for over 14 years, and I'd never truly considered drinking or consuming drugs again for over 10. I was so tempted to make a quick stop before getting home to make the pain go away. But I did what I've done for the past 14 years that has never failed me: losing myself in a room filled with music. As soon as I arrived home, I quickly went up to my studio and put on a special playlist that I've curated over the years for when things get rough. I slowly started to come around and feel a little better. I remember I was listening to a J.J. Cale song when suddenly the song was cut off, and a song that I immediately recognized as part of the Infinite Error folder started playing. Strange, I thought, but didn't hesitate in just replaying the song I was previously listening to. But it happened again. In the moment, I said fuck it and just kept listening. I had bigger problems to attend to than worrying about some computer glitch. I wasn't exactly in the mood for that kind of music, but there was something exhilarating about the song that I found distracting in a way that I really needed. Then it started happening again. The song was changing, but this time the lyrics were unmistakably about me, about my past. I will not go into detail about what it said, but the lyrics were a perverse and cruel poem about my childhood, describing things that are so specific to my memories that I was left with no doubt in my mind that something evil and demonic was happening with these songs. It's impossible to explain how crushed I felt in that moment. I struggled to turn off the music and my computer because my hands were shaking horribly. I felt as if the entirety of creation and its spiritual underside had spat on my face. I am lost. I am at my weakest, and I have no explanation for what is going on. I don't know how to make it stop. I've copied the files, deleted them, and yet they spread like a virus, infecting every corner of my life. Now I can't tell where the music ends and I begin. I'm afraid this is no mere glitch. Something evil is attached to these songs, and it's pulling me under. Oh, and there's something else. It started small, just a creeping sensation at the back of my neck, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder for no reason. I tried to shake it off as I worked, but the feeling grew stronger each day. The basement, already oppressive, became unbearable. The long stretch of rooms ahead felt darker, like the shadows were deepening with every step I took. Every time I looked down the corridor, I could swear something was watching me, just beyond the last doorway. It wasn't just my imagination. I'd see it out of the corner of my eye, a figure barely visible, darker than the shadows around it, flickering just at the edge of sight. When that happens, the human mind brushes it off and hides the uneasiness behind some logical explanation. However, after everything that had gone on about the unexplainable folder, I wasn't so sure what to think anymore. I started to avoid going down there, but the work demanded it. Files to retrieve, documents to store. I told myself it was just the isolation, the silence, the stale air that was making me jumpy. But tonight, something changed. It was after hours. The building was quiet, save for the hum of old fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of settling wood. I had just finished stacking the last of the files when I heard it. A soft rustling, like paper being dragged across the floor. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned toward the corridor. It was darker than usual, the light seeming to dim the further I looked. And there, just at the edge of the last doorway, that figure stood again. But this time it wasn't flickering. It was solid, motionless, yet the shadows around it seemed to twist and writhe like living things. I blinked hard, hoping it would disappear like before, but it didn't. It stayed, watching. My mouth went dry, and I stepped back. I glanced at the time, midnight. I glanced back down the hall. The figure had moved closer. I could see it now. Its face, if you could call it that, was nothing more than a void, a hollowed-out absence in the shape of a person. The lights blinked out completely, and then nothing but darkness, and the sound of breathing that wasn't mine. Think you're ready for more? The next story will make you doubt that. Do shadow people exist? I don't think humans are supposed to live like this. Everyone in their own little box, in their own little world. Living on top of each other, sharing the same walls, floors, and ceilings. I know I have neighbors, but what's the hell's their name? Paul? Tud? Who gives a hell? I need to move out of this place because I think I'm going crazy. I know the old lady next door starts every morning on the balcony chain-smoking cigarettes like she doesn't want to see tomorrow. I know the guy upstairs cheats on his wife when she's at work. And I know the girl downstairs plays the clarinet. I know their work schedules. Hell, I even know their sleeping habits. But I don't know a single one of their names. Now, I know that sounds weird, but if you ever lived in an apartment, you know one of the biggest challenges is tuning everyone else's noise out. And I am disabled, so I don't leave my apartment much. But now I'm sure you're wondering what any of this has to do with anything. Well, the old lady next door? She was acting weird. I don't sleep much. It's been that way my entire life. My balcony has a nice view of the east, so I like to spend my mornings watching the sunrise. I've tried talking to my neighbor in the beginning, but she only ever muttered and glared. And so for the better part of the last 5 years living here, we spend every morning sitting in silence, having a coffee and smoke. That is until the other morning. Now I'm always out on my balcony first, when it's still dark out. I don't know why I like it out there so much, but right before sunrise, when the world's still dark and quiet, is the only time I ever feel at peace. Now I know. I mentioned her habit of smoking like she doesn't want to see tomorrow. And truth be told, that's a bit of projection on my part, because some would probably say the same about me. So when I stepped out on my balcony for a 4 a.m. smoke, I nearly jumped out of my skin when I saw her standing there on her balcony, staring at me in complete dark. the light from my balcony's light reflecting back at me. "Are you okay?" I asked hesitantly to no response. We both have spent a lot of time smoking together in awkward silence, and not once have I ever seen her on the balcony without a cigarette, so I asked, "Do you need a cigarette? I just got a new cart, and I could float you a pack." At this point, I never once felt so pressured to fill the empty silence. I lit my cigarette and tried ignoring her, but I could feel her stare burning a hole into my soul, and so I went back inside without finishing my smoke. I'll be the first to admit she's a strange lady. I've never talked to her. I've never seen family visit. I know she smokes Camels, but I don't know much else about her. I tried forgetting about it, figuring she was going senile or something, and she'd eventually go back inside, but she didn't. Each time I went out for a smoke, there she was, staring daggers at me. After the third or fourth time on the balcony, I started getting concerned. So I went to the building manager's apartment and informed him he might need to do a welfare check. I found out that day her name was Pam. Eventually, she went back inside, and I was able to have a smoke. I never heard anything about what happened, and the next day, we both had a quiet smoke in the morning, but I couldn't stop thinking about that night. A couple of days passed, and nothing out of the ordinary happened, until one night I decided I wanted to get out of my apartment and catch a movie with some friends. As I'm leaving my apartment and close the door behind me, there she is. The doorway cracked, her face pressed between the door and the frame, eyes wide and the apartment behind her pitch black. "The shadow people are going to kill me. The shadow people are going to kill me. The shadow people are going to kill me." She whispered the sentence over and over. I'm a big guy, and I wouldn't say I get startled easily, but I almost shit a brick, and I could feel my heart racing as I got out of there as quickly as I could. Still to this day, her big green eyes are burnt into my memory. At this point, I hadn't slept in a while, and so after the movie, I went home and crashed. That next morning, I woke up to a commotion. Pam died that night. I still feel guilty. Maybe there was something I could have done to prevent it, but sometimes, in the middle of the night, I think about the only words she has ever spoken to me. "The shadow people are gonna kill me. The shadow people." It was like something you'd hear in a horror movie, but I try to tell myself she was just demented, and it wasn't a big deal. But that's why I'm posting here tonight. Have you ever seen a shadow person? Because 2 nights ago, when I went out for a smoke, I saw one, standing on her balcony where she was that night. I couldn't see any features, but I could feel its eyes staring at me. I haven't been back on my balcony since. I told the building manager about it and asked if Pam had any family in the apartment because I could hear someone moving around in there. He told me no one should be in the apartment and he'd check it out. But if I'm going to be honest, the building manager is a lazy son of a bitch, and I don't think he ever did. I can still hear faint noises coming from her apartment, but tonight, something happened, and I'm freaking out. I was laying down trying to get some sleep, and from the corner of my eye, I saw it again. There was a shadow of a person standing in my doorway. I jumped up, and it walked out of my room, and when I ran out of my room with the baseball bat I keep at my nightstand, the living room was empty. What the hell was that? I can't help but think of Pam. Are the shadow people real? Are they here for me now? Is my mind playing tricks on because I still feel guilty? Until the other night, I would happily describe myself as a skeptic, but now I'm not so sure. I'm terrified. What should I do? The fear only intensifies from here. The next story is not for the faint of heart. I think I've been cursed by my childhood friend. 20 years ago, I lived in a small remote village in the outskirts of Sindh, Pakistan. A village so isolated that it seemed untouched by time, and the people clung to old stories, passed down through generations. Life was simple there, quieter than the bustle of the cities, and at times it felt almost magical. We had festivals every month or so, grand carnivals that brought Sufi singers, folk storytellers, and wandering traders. It was a celebration of life, community, and heritage. We would laugh and sing and play the traditional games that our ancestors had taught us. And at night, beneath a sky full of stars, the village elders would tell stories, tales of old Sindhi folklore, tales of love, religion, and bravery. I grew up with only one other kid of my age, and her name was Sahar. Our village was so remote that we spent nearly every moment together. We'd walk to school, a long trek that took us over dry hills and across narrow, winding paths. Sometimes we'd talk about the stories we heard from the elders, imagining we were the heroes or heroines of old, facing off against jinn and otherworldly forces. But there was only one thing the elders warned us about more than anything else: the woods. The woods that stretched beyond the village were forbidden. They were thick and gnarled, tangled with roots and shadows that seemed to grow darker the deeper you went. There was an old woman who lived there, they said, a woman no one had seen in years. The elders would look at each other, their faces tightening with a fear they rarely showed, and they'd say, "Stay away from the woods. She keeps to herself, but her presence is a bad omen, and if by chance you see her, don't let her touch you." We were children, of course, so we obeyed our elders, but there is only so much you can do in a village that doesn't have any other entertainment available. We tried our best to avoid the woods even after coming home from school. We would end up playing Ludo outside in the otak all night long, as our elders played Sufi music together. "Would you like to check it out?" Sahar asked me innocently. No, Baba had forbidden us. Don't be such a scaredy cat. Suddenly, it had started raining, and we all were forced to come inside our homes. We said our goodbyes and went to sleep. The next morning, the sky was clear, but it was a windy day. I had decided to not go to the school, but the sound of Sahar outside my house had tempted me to give in. When we walked to the school, we found out that the school had been closed due to the heavy rain of last night, and we had to walk back home. The sky had gotten a lot darker. I think there was a storm coming. Most of the paths leading up to our village had been flooded, and we couldn't take the way back home easily. That's when I felt my arm being pulled. "I think we have to go through the woods." "No way, you know Babajan would get mad." "Well, it's either that or we end up dying here. What do you suppose?" She was annoying, but she was right. I figured Babajan would understand, right? The sky hung heavy with an oppressive darkness, clouds roiling and swirling like a tempestuous sea. The air was thick and laden with the earthy scent of wet soil, as if the very ground was exhaling its last breath. Each gust of wind sent shivers down my spine. The coldness settled in my bones, an unsettling chill that seeped deep, making me feel as if the very essence of life was being sucked out of me. As we went deeper into the woods, the trees loomed over us, their twisted branches clawing at the air. "What if we see her?" I asked. "Don't let her touch you or she'll curse you," she teased. The leaves rustled restlessly beneath our feet, and the shadows crowded us. We heard a branch snapped in the distance, and we saw her. The old woman, she was standing by the path, a bent, withered figure draped in tattered robes. Her skin hung off her bones, gray and cracked like ancient parchment, and her eyes, they were milky white, like she'd been blind for centuries. She looked right at us. No, she saw us, in a way that pierced through flesh and bone, straight into our souls. "Are you from the village?" she asked, her voice as dry as the desert wind. I remember my throat closing up, the words sticking there like glue. Sahar nodded, too scared to speak. The woman's cracked lips twisted into something resembling a smile. "Be careful," she rasped. "A plague is coming to your village. Stay away from the water." I tried to brush her off, laugh it away like the foolish child I was. But when I glanced at Sahar, her face had gone pale, white as a ghost. Her lips trembled, and before I could even say a word, she grabbed my arm and bolted. We ran, the sound of our footsteps and the rain splashing through the mud until we reached the safety of the village. "What happened?" I asked Sahar. "Why did we run? That old woman, she is supposed to be dead. Dead for centuries. She shouldn't exist. It must have been someone playing a prank on us. We shouldn't have run. Do not speak of this to anyone. Promise me? Do not be a fool." I said, "Promise me." She yelled, "I promise," I replied. We never spoke of it again, not for a long time. But things began to change after that. Strange things. The air around the village felt heavier, thicker. Sahar was the first to shut herself away. She stopped coming to school, stopped leaving her house altogether. When I asked her why, all she would say was, "I saw her. I felt her. She touched me. She has cursed me." I didn't believe her. I refused to believe her. But then she fell ill. It started with fever, then boils, dark, festering sores that erupted across her skin. She had a terrible fever for days until one day she vomited blood, stood up, and collapsed right on the floor. It didn't stop with her. It spread. First it was a few people, then a few more. Soon the entire village was stricken. No one could explain it. No doctor, no healer. The elders whispered that the old woman had returned to bring a curse, to punish us for trespassing into her woods. I heard them speak of it in hushed tones, but it wasn't just talk anymore. It was real. The plague consumed the village, took everyone it could, including my parents. The village was nothing but a graveyard now. The grounds was scattered with blood and disease-ridden bodies. I was the only one left alone. Why was I left alone? I had to leave. I had to run away. I had no choice. When I finally left, the land had turned sour, and eventually, the village itself faded from memory, swallowed by time and the sands of the desert. I didn't dare go back. No one could. It was a cursed place, a place that didn't exist to me anymore. I moved to the city, made a life for myself, something I never thought I'd be able to do after everything I'd seen. I got married, started a family. My wife, my children, they became my world, and the village became a distant, shadowy dream. I told myself the curse had stayed behind, buried with the dead. The old woman had touched Sahar. She might have saved me from her curse. Maybe that's why I was spared. But last night, she came back. It started with a dream. At least, I think it was a dream. I woke to find Sahar standing in my bedroom, her figure barely visible in the dark, just a shadow against the wall. My heart raced, my mind screaming that it couldn't be real. She was dead, long gone, buried in that forsaken village. But there she was, and I knew deep down that it wasn't a dream. She whispered, "You survived before, but not anymore. Please don't touch me." I wanted to yell on top of my lungs, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear. I wanted to scream, to wake my wife, but I couldn't. I woke up with a cold sweat the next morning, thanking God that it had all been nothing but a dream. I brewed my coffee and told my kids that they can skip the school today. I would be taking them to the zoo. Why? Every day is a blessing. Don't forget, darling. The kids roared in excitement, and we smiled from ear to ear. I had decided I would go into work today and take an early leave. I had some unfinished work to do. I clocked into work and went straight to my desk to pick up some papers. That's when I heard my phone ring. It was my wife. "Baby, please come home quickly. It's our daughter. She's puking blood." If that gave you chills, this next story will send shivers down your spine. The Whisper Field. I've long been a fan of the unexplained. I enjoy listening to podcasts of the spookiest sort, especially this time of year and when I'm trying to get to sleep. I'm one of those people. However, I have a few things that I tend to avoid plumbing the depths of because they really unsettle me. The Hat Man is one of them. He just freaks me out, and I give him all the due respect that I can. I've experienced light flickers when there's been no electrical problems and strange animals have shown up and watched me. Unfortunately, I started researching what is referred to as the Whisper Field in some circles. There's precious little most people know about it, even though it has been touched upon academically and by governments. A web search on the topic just turns up a random, unsettling soundwave posting. Fortunately, as a poor postgraduate, my skill set includes finding ways to access all the old and forgotten academic sources that not even JSTOR is willing to archive. The deep spaces of the UCLA library smell exactly like you would expect, with some aromas that are best not spoken of. I've collected a little on the Whisper Field, even though if you go to official sources to dig up references, you'll probably get turned away. It took me a lot of work to find information about this, and I wish I hadn't started searching. History of the Whisper Field. In the mid-1950s, a series of scientists allegedly discovered a naturally occurring phenomenon they named the Whisper Field, a low-frequency sound wave that emanated from deep beneath the Earth's crust. The wave itself was imperceptible to human hearing, but over time, anyone exposed to it would begin to hear faint, unintelligible whispers. At first, the whispers were only heard in moments of silence, but eventually they would grow louder, merging into a chorus of distinct voices. The phenomenon was first recorded in 1956 by Dr. Edgar Blevins, a geophysicist investigating anomalous seismic activity. Blevins' team were initially measuring infrasound waves, extremely low-frequency sound waves, below 20 Hz, that can't be detected by the human ear. Infrasound is typically produced by natural events like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and even large weather systems, but what they discovered was far more unsettling. A persistent, low-frequency wave, around 3 Hz, that didn't correlate with any known natural source. Unlike other infrasound waves, which dissipate or get absorbed by the atmosphere, this particular wave appeared to increase in intensity as it traveled along the medium of fault lines. Research on infrasound has shown that frequencies between 7 to 10 Hz can cause feelings of unease, anxiety, and even hallucinations due to the resonance of these frequencies with the human body, particularly the inner ear and brain. However, the whisper field operates at an even lower range, which led Blevins to theorize that the wave subtly interferes with neurological functions over time. Extended exposure appears to alter the brain's alpha and theta waves, which are responsible for relaxation and daydreaming states. This interference seems to trick the brain into perceiving sounds that aren't there, which could explain the whispers described by those affected. While traditional infrasound is usually caused by surface-level events, the whisper field is believed to originate from a deeper, as-yet unknown source beneath tectonic fault lines. Some theorists have posited the existence of subcrustal fluid flows or magnetic anomalies deep within the Earth's mantle that generate this persistent wave. Others speculate it could be linked to ancient, undiscovered volcanic structures that release subtle vibrations through crystallized magma channels. By 1961, studies showed that individuals exposed to the whisper field for over 3 months experienced progressive cognitive decline. The whispers began as background noise, typically dismissed as wind or distant murmurs, but as exposure continued, they became clearer and took on the characteristics of distinct voices, often addressing personal fears or regrets. Brain scans of these individuals revealed abnormal activity in the auditory cortex and hippocampus, regions associated with sound processing and memory formation. The temporal lobe, particularly the amygdala and hippocampus, have been known to react strongly to low-frequency sound. These regions of the brain are tied to emotion and memory, and as exposure to the whisper field persisted, subjects began to experience auditory hallucinations linked to deeply personal events, sometimes resurfacing memories they had forgotten. This suggests that the wave interacts with neural pathways in a way that mimics certain psychoactive substances, causing the brain to distort its perception of reality. Over time, those affected by the whisper field reported vivid, unsettling dreams, often featuring themes of drowning, being buried alive, or being surrounded by shadows. This disruption of normal sleep cycles was theorized to be the result of the wave affecting the brain's delta wave production, responsible for deep sleep. Sleep deprivation, combined with the auditory hallucinations, exacerbated feelings of paranoia and aggression in many victims. In 1965, after several instances of mass hysteria in mining towns located near fault lines, the British Geological Society commissioned a secret task force to study the phenomenon. They hypothesized that the wave could be artificially amplified or disrupted using electromagnetic fields, a theory based on the known interaction between sound waves and certain electrical fields. A series of classified tests were conducted using massive Tesla coils, attempting to generate high-frequency electromagnetic pulses to cancel out the wave. These experiments failed catastrophically. Not only did they fail to disrupt the whisper field, but they also appeared to exacerbate the effect, intensifying the hallucinations, causing dangerous sleepwalking, severe personality shifts, and driving some test subjects to violence. One report indicated that the voices became louder and more coherent immediately after each attempt to disrupt the field, leading to a new, chilling hypothesis that the field wasn't just a passive, natural occurrence. It might be responding as if it were somehow aware of what researchers were doing, even though that was clearly impossible. More recently, organizations like CERN and Deep Earth observatories have picked up faint signatures of the whisper field, but due to its low frequency and wide distribution, it remains elusive. Some fringe researchers speculate that the whisper field might be connected to the Earth's shifting magnetic poles, or could even be an echo of a primordial, large-scale underground life form, dormant beneath the surface for millions of years. There are also rumors that governments have deliberately suppressed research into the whisper field, fearing the social and psychological implications of its discovery. To this day, the whisper field continues to defy scientific explanation. Those who report experiencing it note that the voices always seem to know intimate details of the listener's life, secrets they had never shared, regrets they had long buried. Most unsettling of all, some have reported that the voices in recent years sound closer, no more urgent, and seem to no longer be talking about the past, but rather something forthcoming. My sources are available to anyone who wants them, but I would like to mention an account I obtained from the eldest sister of a young man named Gabe Fuentes. What happened to Gabe wasn't formally reported by the authorities and was otherwise kept quiet at the request of his family and other groups involved. She was able to provide me with the transcription of the notebook found with Gabe's handwriting. The text is included below. Transcription of the last surviving, legible notes from Gabe Olivio Fuentes' notebook. Recovered near Daya, Alaska, October 17, 2018. Daya, Alaska. Weather's perfect for the hike. This place is so quiet next to Skagway. You can hear the past whispering in the wind. Daya is just ghostly now. Very few people left. Only a few ruins from the old Klondike Gold Rush days. Crazy to think this was once a bustling town where thousands set off for the Chilkoot Trail. Now it's just nature reclaiming what's hers. Gonna head up toward the old mining area. Maybe I'll stumble on something interesting. Got deeper into the mountains. Daya is behind me now, and the trees are thick. It's almost too quiet. I stopped for a bit, but when the wind died down, I swear I could hear, well, something. Faint, like the sound of a creek, but no water in sight. Probably just the wind through the trees. Moving on tomorrow. The old Klondike mining camps should be close. Side note, weird how this area is basically erased from history. Most people don't even remember Daya was the start of the trail. It's all Skagway now. I wonder why they abandoned it so fast. Camped out at the base of an old mine. Definitely feels abandoned, but not in the way you'd expect. There's something here, though. I keep hearing this low droning sound coming from deep in the ground. Thought it was machinery at first, but it's too rhythmic. Constant, almost like a hum. Might be some natural thing, like minor earthquake tremors or wind through the tunnels. This place is really geologically active, but I'm just guessing. It's unsettling. Sat by the fire tonight, heard something in the distance. Thought it was an animal at first. Then realized it wasn't any kind of animal I know. No growls, no howls, just soft voices. I'm so exhausted. Gonna crash for the night. The whispers started again. They're not in the distance anymore. They're closer. I thought it was my imagination. Must be the low, grinding sounds or something, like they talk about with old mine shafts. The earth does funny things. Maybe I'm just tired, right? Still, last night, I could have sworn I heard my name. Not loud, barely a murmur. Gabe, Gabe. Nothing clear, just a whisper on the wind. There's no one out here, though. No one for miles. That hum from underground is louder now, too. Constant. I feel it vibrating in my chest, like it's pressing on me, maliciously. Couldn't sleep. The whispers are definitely louder. Sometimes they're just sounds, sometimes words. I don't know how to explain it, but it feels like they're speaking just under my hearing, like I'm catching only fragments of what's being said. The wind doesn't blow much anymore, but the sound is everywhere, like the earth itself is talking. Is that possible? Hell, I don't know. Maybe the isolation's getting to me. Maybe I've been out here too long. I was about to turn back, but I don't know, something keeps pulling me forward. They're saying my name again. Gabe, Gabe. But it's not just whispers now, it's clearer. I went back to the mouth of that mine just to check it out, and I swear I heard something from inside. Not echoes, not wind, voices. Hundreds of them. I tried to rationalize it, just the way sound travels underground, right? But they keep calling my name. I keep thinking about how Daya was abandoned so suddenly. Did they know about this? No one talks about it. They left, and now no one comes back. Weird. They're all around me now. Can't tell what's real anymore. My name. My voice. Their voices. It's hard to write. Everything feels slow. Heavy. I need to get out of here, but I don't think I can anymore. The hum, it's inside me now. Can't stop hearing it. The whispers don't fade, even when I cover my ears, they in me everywhere. Tried to leave, got lost, can't find the trail. The voices know all about me, but I'm afraid of what I'm thinking. They're not just whispers anymore, they're speaking to and through me. I'm not alone, they're here, the air feels thick. I can feel in watching my own voice doesn't feel like mine anymore. It tried to scream, but the sound came out wasn't mine. It wasn't a sound of that, it was them. I hear myself speaking, but it's not me speaking. I'm not speaking anymore. I have to go down. I have to go down deeper, and I don't know why and what I'm looking for anymore. What am I doing here? Why am I here? Why am I out in the forest? It shouldn't have come. It should have gone home. Mom, Dad, I'm so sorry. I don't know what I'm doing. It should have gone home. I'm so sorry, Mom. I love you. Mine's dark, it's so dark down here. I can feel the ground breathing, it's breathing against me. The ground is breathing. I don't know what's my voice and what's theirs anymore. Everything is blending together, the humus inside my head, it's all in my head. But it's not, it's real. There is nothing different between the wind, the whispers and my thoughts. It's all the same. They real the same, we're all the same. It's getting hard to see. They told me to leave the notebook here. If you find it, tell my mom that I hope Stella is okay. I'm sorry. You have to feed her now, but I have to go. I'm sorry, I just have to go. I'll miss you, but my voice is theirs now. Gabe Fuente's body was never found. The journal was recovered near an abandoned mine entrance in the Daya region. No further searches were conducted due to increasingly dangerous weather conditions and strange auditory phenomena reported by the search team, several of whom never reported back to the group. Their whereabouts are still unknown. Blevins, Edgar. Infrasonic Anomalies and Deep Earth Phenomena, a Preliminary Study. The Geological Society of London, 1967. This early work by Dr. Edgar Blevins documents the first recorded instances of low-frequency sound waves beneath the Earth's surface, now known as the whisper field. Blevins outlines his initial findings from seismic sensors and introduces his hypothesis regarding deep subcrustal origins. British Geological Society Report Task Force on Anomalous Infrasound, Classified Field Tests 1965 to 1967. Archive documents, reference number BGS 1967-C23. A declassified document outlining the British Geological Society's failed attempts to interfere with the whisper field using Tesla coils and other electromagnetic devices. Carter, L. and Simmons, H. Effects of Infrasound on the Human Brain, A Decade of Research. Neurological Journal of Geophysics, Vol 18, No. 2, 1976, p. 35-49. This comprehensive review details how infrasound, particularly frequencies below 10 Hz, can affect the human brain. The paper explores both the psychophysiological effects and the historical context, referencing the early studies of the whisper field. Ortega, Maria L. The Neural Resonance Hypothesis, Infrasound and Temporal Lobe Stimulation. Cognitive Neuroscience Review, Vol. 44, No. 1, 2005, pp. 1-238. Ortega's study links low-frequency sound waves to heightened activity in the temporal lobe, offering a modern perspective on how phenomena like the whisper field could cause auditory hallucinations by affecting the hippocampus and amygdala. Ritter, A. and Vaughn, P. Geological Fault Lines and the Propagation of Persistent Infrasound Waves. Journal of Seismic Studies, Vol. 52, No. 4, 1987, pp. 221-237. This paper describes the propagation of infrasound along geological fault lines, supporting the theory that tectonic activity could amplify and carry the whisper field. The study also investigates the unusual durability and travel distance of these waves compared to standard infrasound emissions. To listen, Mariah. The Psychological and Social Effects of Long-Term Infrasound Exposure. Journal of Environmental Psychology, Vol. 26, No. 6, 2013, pp. 515-530. Tillison's paper explores the long-term psychological impact of exposure to persistent low-frequency sound waves, including paranoia, aggression, and auditory hallucinations. She draws parallels between her findings and reports of the whisper field's effects on isolated communities. Verne, Jonathan. The Mariana Trench Anomaly, A New Look at Deep Earth Infrasound. Global Seismic Review, Vol. 61, No. 3, 1992, pp. 410-425. Verne builds on Blevins' original work, focusing on the Mariana Trench as a potential source of the whisper field. His analysis includes modern seismological data that identifies unusual infrasound signatures consistent with Blevins' early measurements. Oh yes, the Mariana Trench. An old professor of mine who's into deep-sea research told me about an incident earlier this year involving an exploration of the trench. With all the other incidents in recent years, this one didn't get much traction. I'm torn between whether to dig deeper into this or just let it go. But I've told others, and I'm sorry for that. As soon as I started talking to my friends about what I was researching, they started to hear strange things when out in nature. One of them will never talk to me again because he used to love going on hikes, and now he can't do it, especially at night. Of course, I've heard the whispers too. I live near one of the biggest fault systems in the world. I can ignore them most days, and they just feel like a persistent, low-grade headache clawing against my skull. Sometimes they sound like my mother with all the judgment and disappointment laid on thick. Other times, they just sound like me and all the voices I usually try to shut out. I don't know how much longer I can keep going, but I need to know what it is and why, even if it kills me. What you've heard so far is nothing compared to the horror in the next tale. I found a peeping Tom in my apartment building. I remember the day I moved into the apartment. I was excited. I thought a fresh start in this big building, with its clean, sterile hallways and well-manicured lawns, would finally bring me peace. Maybe I'd meet new people. Finally make some friends. The space was quiet. It was comforting. But I never did make friends. I kept to myself, spent most of my time at my desk, struggling to make ends meet with freelance gigs that barely paid enough for rent. The walls felt so thick at first, like I was insulated from everything outside. A cocoon. But now it feels like the walls are alive. At first, everything was fine. I relished the quiet, the solitude. I'd sit in my cramped little room, the desk shoved against the single window overlooking the alley, and write. The sounds of the city filtered in through the thin walls, the hum of traffic, the distant blare of sirens, the occasional argument spilling out from the neighboring apartments. But in here, I felt safe. That's when I found the hole. I discovered it by accident one night while rearranging the furniture. The fridge was old and heavy, and when I tried to push it against the wall, it scraped across the floor with a hideous screech. That's when I saw it. A small, dark space, hidden behind where the fridge used to sit. It was odd, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. A perfectly carved passage, almost too perfect. Like it had been waiting for me. At first, I ignored it. I pushed the fridge back into place and told myself it didn't matter. It was just an old building, quirky, filled with forgotten nooks and crannies. But that hole, it lingered in my mind. Days passed, and I kept thinking about it. Every time I sat down to work, it was there, gnawing at the back of my brain. What was inside? Where did it lead? Curiosity got the better of me. One night I pulled the fridge back, and there it was, dark, beckoning. I crawled inside, feeling the cool, stale air wrap around me as I squeezed my way through. It wasn't long before the narrow passage opened into a hidden hallway. The walls were damp, the smell of mildew thick in the air. Trash littered the floor, discarded clothes, candy wrappers, and God knows what else. I should have turned back right then, but something about that hallway, it drew me in, like it was meant for me. The first time I crawled through the hole, I noticed how narrow the passageway was. The air inside was thick, humid, and I could barely breathe as I shimmied forward on my hands and knees. The walls brushed against my skin, wet and clammy, like some kind of living organism. The space around me pulsed, like it was alive. My skin crawled, but I couldn't stop. I kept moving, though, drawn forward by a strange compulsion, until I found myself staring into a peephole. It was a young couple. They were laughing, sitting close together on the couch, so happy, so unaware of the world outside. I watched them for a long time, my breath shallow. They didn't see me. They couldn't see me, but something about the way they were, it reminded me of something I'd lost. I didn't realize how much time had passed until the man looked directly at the wall where the peephole was. My heart stopped. I swear for a moment he saw me. His eyes locked onto mine, even though there was no way he could. I scrambled back, my hands shaking, but I couldn't stop. I moved forward toward the next apartment. Each apartment was worse than the last. In one room, a group of friends were playing video games, music blaring through the speakers. Their laughter echoed through the walls, loud and mocking. They were oblivious to everything around them, even as I pressed my face closer, hungry to be part of their world. But I wasn't. I was nothing more than a shadow, a ghost in their space. The next room. I wish I hadn't looked. There was an old woman. She was hunched over, knitting something in the dim light, her bony fingers trembling as they worked the yarn. She looked just like my grandmother. But when she turned her head to the side, I saw her face, sunken eyes, skin hanging loose like she was already dead. I stepped back, gasping for air, but it was like the walls had grown tighter around me. Then came the room with the violent sound. I heard it before I saw it. The dull thud of something heavy hitting flesh, the sickening sound of bones breaking. My stomach churned as I looked through the peephole. A man stood over a woman's lifeless body, his chest heaving, his face twisted in rage. Blood stained the floor, the walls. The woman's eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. I wanted to scream, to call the police, to do anything, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, my hand trembling against the wall. The man towered over her lifeless body, breathing heavily, and then he looked up, right at the wall, right at me, and his lips curled into a smile. I stumbled back, my heart racing. What the hell was this place? Who had made this passage? Was I the only one who knew about it? My mind was a blur of questions, but before I could turn and run, I saw another door. This one was different. There was a light shining underneath it, spilling into the dark hallway. It beckoned me, just like the hole had. I approached, my breath shallow, and pressed my eye to the peephole. It was a room unlike any of the others. The walls were lined with mirrors, lights framing each one like a backstage dressing room. There were costumes scattered across the floor, feather bows, sequin dresses, hats of all shapes and sizes. And in the center of the room was a single chair, facing a mirror. Something inside me shifted. I opened the door and stepped inside. The air was different here, warmer somehow, inviting. There was a large, ornate mirror with lights around the edges, like something you'd see in a dressing room. There were clothes scattered everywhere, old costumes, hats, masks. It looked like a movie set. My breathing slowed. This place, it felt familiar. I stepped inside, drawn to the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, but there was something wrong with it. My face looked twisted. The longer I stared, the more my reflection began to move on its own. It smiled when I didn't. It tilted its head, eyes narrowing like it knew. I bolted back into my apartment, heart pounding against my ribcage. I practically jumped through the hole. The memory of that horrific smile haunted me. The man who killed his wife. I needed to escape, to block it all out. But how could I? The hole behind the fridge loomed in my mind like a sinister invitation. I needed a moment to breathe, to gather my thoughts. What should I have done? Should I call the police? I walked to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I drank a glass of water. I stared out the window at the dimly lit parking lot below. Something felt off. Maybe I was just hallucinating. As nightfall covered the skies, I decided to sleep away the uncertain reality, to wash away the horrors of the day. But as darkness wrapped around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The walls whispered secrets I couldn't decipher, and shadows danced just beyond my field of vision. Then came the sound, a soft rustling like fabric brushing against skin. My heart raced as I sat up, squinting into the darkness. There, in the corner of my room, was a figure. Dark and menacing, it hovered just out of reach. I felt paralyzed, unable to scream or move. When I finally mustered the courage to turn on the light, the figure morphed, contorting into the shapes of my room. The shadow stretched, expanding until it seemed to breathe. It lunged toward me, but before it could reach me, it vanished, like smoke in the wind. I woke up the next morning. It was all a dream, the sunlight filtering through my blinds like a warning. I stumbled into the kitchen, the haunting memory of the dark figure still fresh in my mind. I needed caffeine, something to ground me. As the coffee brewed, I tried to shake off the creeping unease. That's when my eyes met with the fridge, or maybe behind it. The hole was still there. The uncertain reality was real. The hole became bigger than ever. Maybe there was a peeping Tom in the building. I decided to talk to the landlord. I stepped outside, ready to confront him about the uncertainty in my apartment. but the hallway was empty. No one stirred, no voices echoed back. It was dead silent. I knocked on a few doors, but nobody answered. It felt strange, but maybe most of the tenants were sleeping. Just as I was about to head back inside, I spotted a man dressed entirely in black, carrying a heavy bag. His movements were erratic, as if he was in a hurry. "Hey," I called, trying to sound casual. "Excuse me, can you?" But he ignored me and slipped into the elevator. As the doors began to close, I caught a glimpse of something red peeking from the bag. My heart raced as realization struck, a glimmer of blood. It was the man I'd seen earlier, the one who'd killed his wife. I stumbled back, horror gripping me like a vice. I bolted up the stairs, my legs feeling like jelly. I burst through my door, gasping for breath, and darted toward the fridge wall. I had to know. I ripped the fridge away, my hands trembling. There it was, the hole, the same gaping maw I had discovered before. Was it really there? Was any of this real? Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my phone to call the police, but the signal was dead. No bars. A soft whisper slithered through the hole, chilling me to the bone. "Come in," it beckoned, low and seductive. I felt drawn to it, as if it were a siren's call, promising solace. "No," I muttered to myself, backing away. I tried to block the hole with my hands, but every time I turned, it was still there, larger than before, beckoning me with its darkness. I could hear voices now, faint and melodious, urging me to return. "Come back," they whispered. "We can make you whole again." I crawled through the hole. The familiar sensation of panic washed over me as I entered the narrow corridor. The atmosphere felt different, thicker, more suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. As I moved forward, the same scenes unfolded around me. Couples laughing, friends playing games, but the warmth and laughter felt tainted. My skin prickled, the hair on my arms standing on end. I continued deeper into the darkness, knowing I had to confront whatever lay ahead. And that's when I found him. The same room as before, each item stood in its place perfectly still. Only a new member had moved into the building. A body lay dead in the corner of the room, its skin pale, its fingernails elongated and dirty, as if he was the filth of the building. I touched him. His body decomposed right before me. Black liquid oozed of its body, like he had been dead for many a millennium. I had found him. I had found the peeping Tom. With each passing moment, I felt a change within me. My body began to feel strange. My skin became pale and clammy, like I was living in a world without sunlight. My fingers elongated, stretching unnaturally as if reaching for something just out of grasp. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and my reflection was grotesque, twisted beyond recognition. I touched my face, feeling the cool, clammy surface of my skin, the features melting and reforming in the warped glass. I could feel the walls of my apartment morphing around me, the texture becoming fleshy, almost breathing, as veins pulsed underneath the surface. Panic surged through me. "What is happening?" I gasped, scratching at the walls, desperate to escape this nightmare. My nails dug into the surface, but instead of breaking through, they sunk in like flesh, giving way beneath my fingertips. But suddenly, I woke up in my bed again. Only this time, it was all a dream? No, it can't be. I walked into the kitchen to brew myself coffee. My eyes shifted themselves towards the hole. It had grown bigger. The scent of coffee brewing filled the air, but it did little to soothe the rising anxiety clawing at my insides. My gaze shifted toward the fridge wall, where the hole waited like an insatiable maw. It had grown bigger. The memory of the dark figure, the chaos, and the grotesque reflection of myself danced through my mind. I shivered, a chill creeping up my spine. I felt a magnetic pull toward it, an undeniable urge to go inside and re-witness the events, to make sense of the madness swirling in my head. Tonight, I would return. As night fell, I sat in my dimly lit apartment, anxiety mingling with anticipation. The coffee had long gone cold, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, closing in around me. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the journey ahead. The moment I crawled through the hole, I felt the familiar sensation wash over me, a cold embrace that wrapped around my body like a shroud. The corridor yawned before me, beckoning me deeper into its twisted embrace. Each step echoed through the emptiness, and I could feel the anticipation thrumming in my veins. The scenes returned. Laughter, love, sorrow, violence. They unfolded before me like memories, each moment drawing me closer to the dark truth lurking just beyond my reach. As I traversed the corridor, I caught glimpses of life happening all around me, the pulse of the building thrumming beneath my feet. But today, I stumbled upon a room filled with clothes and costumes, the remnants of lives lived outside of mine. My gaze fell on a bowler hat resting on a chair. I reached for it, slipping it onto my head. As I stared into the mirror, I felt a strange shift, a weight lifting, a lightness in my chest. I wasn't me anymore. I started to dance, laughing at my reflection as I spun in circles. The hat slipped down over my eyes, and for a moment I forgot everything. Forgot the blood, the death, the darkness. It was just me and the mirror. I felt less lonely, but when I lifted the hat, my reflection wasn't dancing. It was standing still, grinning at me with wide, unblinking eyes. And behind me, I saw something move. I began to move, swaying to some invisible rhythm, dancing in front of the mirror like a man possessed. It felt good, freeing, like I was shedding my old self, becoming someone new, someone more alive. The people in the building, they didn't know me. They didn't see me. But I saw them. I was with them. Their lives, their secrets, they were mine now. I was the one who watched. I was the one who knew. Now I was the peeping Tom. Now I wasn't just some lonely writer anymore, barely scraping by in a tiny apartment. I had become more than that. I was the one who moved through the walls, the one who saw everything, the one who danced in the dark while they lived their ordinary, oblivious lives. The whole had made me whole. All along, it had been me, the one watching, the one lurking. Those people in their apartments, they weren't strangers anymore. They were my friends, my family. And the man who had killed that woman, he was part of it too. He didn't know I had seen him, but that didn't matter. I had his secret now, and that made him mine. I laughed, and it felt good to laugh again. When was the last time I had laughed like that? I stood up, adjusting the hat on my head, and walked back down the hallway. The doors, the rooms, the people, they were all part of my world now, my hidden empire. And as I made my way back to the hole, back to my little apartment, I felt complete. Madness had consumed me, and reality had become me. The hole had been waiting for me. This place had been waiting for me. And now that I was here, I could see everything clearly. As I sit here, typing away a story I wish no one can read, just know, I am the peeping Tom, and maybe, just maybe, I'm watching you right now. As you read these words, as your eyes move over the blue screen, as you sit there in your quiet little life, maybe I'm there, just behind you, just out of sight, watching, waiting. You aren't alone. I am with you, for you are my friend. If you wish to meet me, maybe crawl into a hole just like I did. You might even find me there, or maybe become the next me. If you thought the last story was unsettling, brace yourself for what's coming next. I've worked as a crime scene investigator for 25 years. This is my weirdest case. On the 25th of November 2018, the victim pulled into a budget motel in the early hours of the morning. He booked room 12 for a 3-day stay. And on the 4th day, the owner of the establishment sent his son to check on the victim. What he found was something that someone his age should never have witnessed. Or anyone for that matter. By the time I arrived at the scene, it had already been cordoned off. Members of the county police department had swarmed the area, and in the absence of the sun, it was the blue and red flashing lights that cast their glow over the building. I made my way past the tenants who were half asleep, doing their best at giving witness testimonial. I stepped by a particularly shaken forensic pathologist who was trying to call his mother and entered room 12. Now, I've been working as a crime scene investigator for more than 20 years. I have dealt with some truly confounding scenes before. In 2006, a body of a missing hiker was found in the woods just on the county line. It had been burned to a crisp, but only the upper half. Below the waist was completely untouched, as was the surrounding area. More recently, a farmer reported a break-in just after New Year's Eve. Presumably, someone had broken into his warehouse, which housed an industrial animal carcass shredder. It had been used in the night, and a pile of jellied flesh was found clumped at its mouth. Horrifically, it was eventually proven to be human, although couldn't be identified beyond that. Only one other thing was found at the scene. Within the remains was a small steel plaque about the size of a business card. with the number 002916 engraved in it. I say all this for simple context. I am no stranger to the unexplainable, but what I saw in room 12, it still keeps me up at night. The following are excerpts from the crime scene report I filed that day. Incident number 240711. Date of incident, November 29th, 2018. Time of arrival, 11:54 p.m. Location, room 12, Sir Sleep-A-Lot Motel. Yellow Smoke County Reporting Officer, Detective Arthur Graham, Yellow Smoke County Police Department. Victim name, John Doe, name yet to be confirmed through fingerprint or DNA. Gender, male. Age estimated to be mid-40s, occupation unknown. Suspects, none at present. The victim checked into the Sir Sleep-A-Lot Motel on the morning of November 25th, 2018. He informed the motel owner, Mr. John Kelly, that he would be staying for 3 days. No known associates or visitors during the stay. Victim was found laying on bed in supine position. Victim had skin removed crudely. Patches of flesh hang loosely, revealing bone in some areas. Teeth and dents on right part of pelvic bone will be examined. The victim's head is absent from the scene. Notably, the body had been dressed in what appeared to be women's undergarments, specifically a pair of lace stockings and a torn satin slip. Neither items of clothing belonged to the victim. The body was likely dressed post-mortem. Addendum. Marks on right part of pelvic bone were positively identified as being from a human juvenile, estimated as between the ages of 3 and 6. No dental record have been traced. Blood covers every inch of the room's 4 walls and carpet. The blood spray appears to be inconsistent with splatter from traumatic injury, possible use of pressurized device. The amount of blood was determined to be approximately 2 gallons, or 135% of the victim's total volume. Teeth were found on the room's desk, 33 in total, arranged into a circular pattern 10 inches in diameter. The careful arrangement appears to be ritualistic. The teeth are currently assumed to have been belonging to the victim. The location of the victim's head has not been identified. Addendum. The findings of the forensic odontologist have determined that 32 of the 33 teeth belong to a person matching the victim's description, a Caucasian male in his 40s. One of the teeth matches a younger Caucasian female. It was eventually connected through dental records to be from 24-year-old Alyssa Hadland, reported missing in 1997. The Hadland case was archived in 1999 due to absence of evidence. The victim's tongue was discovered in the bathroom sink, exhibiting a complete severance at the base. The incision appeared clean and precise, suggesting the use of a surgical grade or extremely sharp cutting instrument. Notably, the tongue was found in isolation within the sink, devoid of any other biological material, indicating that it may have been intentionally relocated post-excision. First responders noted signs of tampering on the coin-operated television in the room, which intermittently activated to static approximately once an hour. The television will be deconstructed for forensic examination to recover latent fingerprints and other trace evidence related to its manipulation. Addendum. Both of the victim's eyes were recovered from the interior of the room's coin-operated television. The television screen had been removed and the eyes were placed within the cavity where the cathode ray tube was situated. This positioning suggests deliberate placement, indicating a possible symbolic motive. The only item of clothing found at the scene belonging to the victim was one pair of denim jeans, which witness John Kelly recalls being worn by the victim the morning he checked in. The jeans were contaminated with the victim's blood. In the pockets were found a one-way bus ticket from the towns of Cosgrave to Mayor's Income, 1 packet of apple-flavored gum, and a button. No other possessions of the victim were found. A pair of small, leather lace-up shoes were found at the foot of the bed. From the lack of blood stains, we can assume the shoes were placed there after the homicide. Addendum A. A shirt likely belonging to the victim was found 3 weeks later, partially buried in a field in San Tommaso, a small town 240 miles south of Yellow Smoke. The shirt matched the description given by John Kelly of the victim. Blood samples taken from the shirt were a strong match to those taken from the crime scene, although without the identity of the victim, a definitive link is challenging to corroborate. Addendum B. The small shoes found at the crime scene were dated to 1909 and determined to have some value among antique dealers. Due to their small size, they can be assumed to be children's shoes. The room showed no obvious signs of damage. The furniture appeared to have been undisturbed, although a Bible was missing from the bedside cabinet. Neither John Kelly nor his son David, lead witnesses of the case, recall seeing the victim with any luggage. For this reason, it is unclear if his possessions were taken or if he simply had none to begin with. The motive of this homicide remains unclear. I'll save you the rest of the procedural formalities. I've lost track of how many nights I've spent awake, staring at my computer screen, reading and rereading this report. It stayed with me for the past 6 years, constantly at the back of mind. At my personal behest, the case remained open despite insufficient evidence and a complete lack of any leads. When it was finally shelved at the beginning of this year, they were no closer to solving it than we were the day we found him. Earlier this week, I learned that it had been reopened by the FBI. I assumed that there must be someone else in this department who felt the same way about the case as I did, strong enough to reach out and request assistance from the feds. I was tasked with compiling any and all digital evidence we had on the case onto a USB flash. I felt weird combing through all the reports, files, and forensics. It felt like I was visiting an old friend. I added the documents I wrote up on the day, the dozens of crime scene photos and witness statements. I've studied them all meticulously myself. I doubted some Yale boy with a corner office could do any better. I kept trailing through the earmarked files, checking and double-checking if there was anything I'd missed. It was dark now. I spent the day working from home, hunched over my computer in my sorry excuse for a library. That's what my job mostly consists of now. I couldn't wait for retirement. Maybe then I would have the time to read some of these books I have lying around. I decided I was finished for the night. I'd squeezed every piece of relevant information I could find onto that hard drive. It was up to the FBI now. I only hoped that if our victim left any family behind, they could one day get some closure from this. I was about to shut my computer down when something caught my eye. Witness1.mp3. It was an audio file. Somehow, I hadn't noticed it before. Hell, I don't think I had even listened to it before. To my knowledge, all the witness statements taken that night were written. I clicked on it, figuring it must have been taken from David Kelly, the kid who'd found the body. I took a sip of my last dregs of coffee and sat back in my chair, jacking up the volume. The audio wasn't the best quality. It was shrouded in the static of an analog recording, and to my shock, the supposed first witness had a woman's voice. The following is a transcript of what was on that file. First responder. What were you doing in the area before you discovered the body? Witness 1. I'm staying in room 14, the room next door to where it happened. Been there for the past 2 weeks, thereabouts. I've come on hard times recently. You know how it is. I was living out of a van until this, but it wasn't exactly reliable. First responder. Apologies, ma'am. I meant what were you doing immediately before discovering the body? Right. Well, I came back from work around 9. I clean at the elementary school in town. I came back and spent the rest of the day in my room. I had dinner and I was just catching up with the news before I went to sleep. First responder. Can you describe how and when you found the body? Witness 1. Gee, it must have been around 10. I was turning in for the night when I heard a banging noise from next door. I guessed he must have brought a lady friend over, so I tried my best to ignore it, but it kept getting louder. It didn't sound like a headboard neither, more like someone chopping wood. It was too much for me to ignore, so I got up to go complain. I found the door unlocked, and it opened wide up when I knocked. That's when I saw him, that poor man. First responder, could you please describe the scene you came across as detailed as you can? Witness 1. It was terrible, just terrible. I saw my neighbor kneeling in the corner of his room. His head had been cut off. Can you imagine that? There was blood covering everything around him. I almost vomited there and then. Then I saw the man in the bathroom. There's a pause. First responder, could you please go on? You said there was someone else at the scene? Witness 1. Yeah, a real weirdo. I didn't notice him at first. He was just peeking out from behind the bathroom door, watching me. When I did finally notice him, we just stared at each other for a moment or two. Then, he just strolled out from his little hiding place. Another pause. First responder, please continue. I assure you everything you have to say will be of some importance to our investigation. Start by describing this man you saw. Witness 1. Okay then. He was a freak, I'll say it. When I got a good look at him, I saw that he had this great bulbous head. He was bald as a newborn, and the entire back part of his head was all deformed and sagging down. I think he had this disease. Oh, what's it called? A boy I went to school with had it. First responder, are you thinking of hydrocephalus? Yes. Yeah, that's it, hydrocephalus. But it was much worse than that kid I knew. Sorry if I'm coming across as rude, but it looked like some horrible octopus. And the front part of his head was far too thin. He has this pointy chin and cheekbones. His eyes were as bulging as his skull, all yellow and white. I think he had cataracts. Oh, and he must have been around 7 feet tall at least. He was hunching over where he met the ceiling. First responder, can you describe what he was wearing? Witness 1, sure. He had this battered old duster coat on. It was black, but he was covered in these stitched rags of red and green. The coat hung down to the floor, but I could make out the tips of brown leather boots poking out from the hem. Can you? Oh, pardon my interrupting, but the man he was holding this, well, I don't know what it was. It looked like a lobster pot with a handle and must be 24 blades sticking out of it. Knives mostly, and razor blades, axe heads, chains, that sort of stuff. Anyway, go on. First responder. Right. What did you do when he came closer to you? Witness 1. Well, I ran. I just ran. Out of the motel and down the road until I realized everything I owned was in my room. I didn't fancy having to start over from nothing for a third time, so I came back, and that's when you bumped into me. All right, and how long was it from discovering the body until you called 911? Witness 1. Oh, I didn't call 911, honey. First responder. You didn't? Oh no, by the time I came back from my little jog, the place was already crawling with police. I still haven't been allowed back in my room. Are you aware that? And his speech became muffled after that, until the recording was nothing but static hum that'd been in the background since the beginning. After hearing this for the first time, I didn't know what to think. I just sat in my old oak chair until my wife came in to tell me that she was going to bed. I kissed her goodnight and went back to aimlessly staring at the computer screen. Eventually, I closed it and stood up. I took the USB stick and left it on my desk. I left the room and locked the door behind me. I changed, washed, and climbed into bed with my wife. I kissed her on the back of her neck and tried to fall asleep. That thing that did this was still out there. But that wasn't my problem anymore.